Hey everyone, welcome to the Midnight Library. Tonight, we're settling in for a long journey through one of history's most fascinating stories. Not a story of sudden catastrophe, but of slow transformation. Not a tale of one dramatic moment, but of centuries unfolding like pages turning in the wind. We're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm historical narratives, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating these long-form historical explorations. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's fascinating to see our community spread across the world, all gathered here to learn about the past. Now dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. We're going to take our time tonight because this is a story that demands patience just as it took centuries to unfold. Introduction: the slow death of an empire. When we think about the fall of Rome, we often picture dramatic scenes. Barbarian hordes storming through gates, buildings burning, an empire collapsing overnight like a house of cards. But that's not what happened. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day, or a year, or even a decade. It died slowly over centuries, piece by piece, like an ancient tree that grows hollow from within while still standing tall. The year traditionally given for Rome's fall is 476 AD, when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young man with the ironically symbolic name of Romulus Augustulus. His name echoed both the legendary founder of Rome and its first emperor, as if history itself were making a bitter joke. But by the time Romulus Augustulus lost his throne, the Western Roman Empire was already a shadow. The real fall had been happening for generations, unfolding in 1,000 small catastrophes, each one barely noticed at the time, but together forming a tide that no one could stop. To understand how Rome fell, we need to understand what Rome was. At its height, the Roman Empire was the greatest political structure the Western world had ever seen. It stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. It encompassed the entire Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, as if the water itself belonged to them. This vast territory was home to perhaps 60 million people, maybe more. They spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, lived in climates ranging from frozen to scorching. Yet all of them in some way considered themselves part of Rome. They used Roman coins. They traveled on Roman roads. They appealed to Roman courts for justice. They lived under the protection of Roman legions. The empire wasn't just a military conquest. It was a system, a way of organizing the world that seemed, to those living within it, as permanent as the stars. But nothing lasts forever. And tonight, we're going to explore how this seemingly eternal structure came apart. We'll move slowly through the centuries, from the crisis of the 3rd century through the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, through waves of barbarian invasions and internal decay, until finally we reach that symbolic day in 476 when the Western Empire simply ceased to exist. This isn't a story with simple villains or easy answers. The fall of Rome had many causes, each intertwined with the others like threads in a rope slowly fraying. Economic problems fed military weakness. Military weakness invited invasions. Invasions disrupted trade. Disrupted trade worsened economic problems. Political instability made everything worse. Religious changes altered the cultural landscape. The division of the empire into East and West created new tensions. Each problem compounded the others, creating a spiral that, once begun, proved impossible to stop. And here's what makes this story so haunting. The people living through it often didn't realize what was happening. To them, life continued. Markets still opened. Crops were still planted. Children were still born. The emperor in Rome, or later in Ravenna, still issued decrees. The forms of the empire persisted long after its substance had evaporated. They were living in the ruins of Rome while still calling it Rome, not recognizing that the world their grandparents had known was already gone. So let's begin at a moment when Rome still seemed invincible, a moment when the cracks were just beginning to show. The height of Roman power, an empire at its peak. To understand Rome's fall, we first need to appreciate just how high it had risen. In the 2nd century AD, during what historians call the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, the empire reached its greatest extent and its greatest stability. This was the age of what later historians would call the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 96 AD to 180 AD. These weren't perfect men, and their reigns weren't without war or hardship. But compared to what came before, and especially to what came after, this was Rome's golden age. Under Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent. His conquests pushed the frontier across the Danube River into Dacia, present-day Romania, securing valuable gold mines. He campaigned east into Mesopotamia, briefly conquering the Parthian capital. On maps, the Roman Empire looked like a vast, irregular shape enclosing the Mediterranean, its borders marked by rivers, deserts, and oceans. It seemed as permanent as geography itself. The economy during this period hummed with activity. Roman roads, built to move legions quickly, instead carried merchants and their goods. Grain from Egypt fed Rome and other cities. Olive oil from Spain lit lamps across the empire. Wine from Gaul satisfied sophisticated palates. Silk from distant China, carried along trade routes that connected Rome to civilizations they barely knew existed, adorned the wealthy. The Mediterranean became a highway of commerce, connecting Africa, Europe, and Asia in a web of trade that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. Cities flourished. Rome itself, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants, was the largest city the Western world had ever seen. But it wasn't alone. Alexandria in Egypt, Carthage in Africa, Antioch in Syria, Ephesus in Asia Minor. These were all major urban centers with populations in the hundreds of thousands. They featured amenities that seem remarkable even today. Public baths, aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant sources, theaters, amphitheaters, forums for public gatherings, libraries, temples to countless gods. The urban infrastructure of the Roman Empire was so sophisticated that it wouldn't be surpassed in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The Roman army during this period was a marvel of organization and effectiveness. The legions, those famous formations of heavy infantry, were the empire's sword. Each legion, numbering about 5,000 men, was a self-contained unit capable of marching 20 miles a day, constructing a fortified camp each night, and fighting pitched battles against any enemy. They were supported by auxiliary forces, cavalry units, archers, slingers, drawn from peoples throughout the empire. These troops received regular pay, and after 25 years of service, they were granted Roman citizenship if they didn't already have it, a powerful incentive for loyalty. The frontiers of the empire were marked by elaborate defensive systems. In Britain, Hadrian's Wall stretched 73 miles across the narrowest part of the island, a stone barrier with forts, watchtowers, and a garrison of thousands. Along the Rhine and Danube, a line of forts and fortified towns faced the Germanic tribes beyond. In the east, fortresses guarded against the Parthian Empire, Rome's only rival as an organized state. These weren't just military installations. They were symbols of Roman power, permanent announcements that beyond this line was barbarian territory, chaos, the uncivilized world. Culturally, Rome in this period achieved a synthesis that would define Western civilization for millennia. Latin, the language of Rome, became the common tongue of administration and high culture in the West, while Greek served the same function in the East. This bilingual empire created a cultural exchange that enriched both traditions. Roman writers like Tacitus and Suetonius recorded history. Poets like Virgil and Ovid were read and memorized. Greek philosophy, especially Stoicism, influenced Roman thought. The legal system, refined over centuries, developed principles of justice that would eventually form the basis of law in most of Europe. But even at this peak, problems existed beneath the surface, subtle hints of future troubles that few recognized at the time. The empire's borders, impressive as they seemed, were in reality a source of constant pressure. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube weren't static populations. They migrated, merged, split apart, formed confederations. Some sought peaceful trade with Rome. Others raided across the border for plunder. All of them were attracted to Roman wealth and organization, watching with hungry eyes as merchants traveled between prosperous Roman cities. The borders held, but only through constant vigilance and regular military campaigns to remind the tribes of Roman power. The economy, prosperous as it was, ran on structures that couldn't last forever. Roman agriculture relied heavily on slave labor, prisoners taken in conquest. But as the empire stopped expanding, the supply of new slaves dried up. The mines that provided precious metals, especially silver for coins, were gradually depleting. Trade goods moved easily because Rome maintained the roads, protected the sea lanes, and provided stable currency. But all of this depended on continued political stability and military strength. It was a system that worked beautifully as long as nothing went seriously wrong. The army, seemingly invincible, faced its own challenges. Recruitment was becoming more difficult. Roman citizens, especially those in Italy, increasingly avoided military service. The legions recruited more heavily from the provinces, and sometimes from beyond the borders, taking in barbarians who were offered pay and the promise of citizenship. These soldiers fought well, but their loyalty was more to their generals and to their pay than to abstract concepts of Rome and empire. The army was slowly transforming from a citizen militia, defending their homeland, into a professional force that might serve whoever paid them. Politically, the empire rested on an unstable foundation. There was no clear system of succession. When an emperor died, theoretically the Senate might choose a successor, or the previous emperor might have adopted an heir. But in practice, the army often made the decision by acclaiming their favorite general. This worked fine when emperors lived long lives and chose capable heirs, as the 5 good emperors had done. But it contained the seeds of civil war, waiting for the right circumstances to sprout. And those circumstances arrived in 180 AD when Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors and a Stoic philosopher who wrote his meditations while campaigning on the Danube frontier, died and left the empire to his biological son, Commodus. Marcus Aurelius had broken the pattern of adoption that had served the empire so well, choosing blood over ability. It was a decision that would have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Commodus proved to be vain, cruel, and erratic. He neglected affairs of state to fight as a gladiator in the arena, debasing the imperial dignity. He renamed Rome and the months of the year after himself. He executed senators on flimsy charges and governed through favorites who enriched themselves through corruption. It was a dramatic shift from his father's careful administration. The Senate loathed him. The army grew restive. And on the last day of 192 AD, he was assassinated, strangled in his bath by a wrestler after a poisoning attempt failed. His death triggered a brief civil war. In the year 193 AD, 5 different men claimed to be emperor. Eventually, Septimius Severus, a general from North Africa, won control. He ruled until 211 AD and founded what would later be called the Severan dynasty. Severus was a capable soldier and administrator, but he also set ominous precedents. On his deathbed, he reportedly told his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men." It was pragmatic advice. The army made emperors, but it also signaled a shift in the empire's foundation, from the ideals of civic virtue to the reality of military power. The Severan dynasty continued until 235 AD. By then, Rome had enjoyed another generation of relative stability, though with increasing pressure on the frontiers and growing economic strain. The empire's expenses were rising. Military campaigns, imperial building projects, the grain dole that fed Rome's urban poor, the extensive bureaucracy required to administer such a vast territory, all of this cost money. Taxes were increased. The silver content of coins was gradually reduced, a form of inflation that cheapened the currency. Prices began to rise. But still, to someone living in the Roman Empire in the early 3rd century, all of this might have seemed like temporary difficulties, problems that could be managed, not harbingers of catastrophe. Rome had existed for nearly 1,000 years, the empire for 2.5 centuries. It had weathered troubles before. It had defeated Hannibal, conquered Gaul, absorbed Greece, outlasted rivals. Surely it would continue. That confidence ended in March of 235 AD, near the Roman frontier town of Mogontiacum, modern-day Mainz in Germany. The emperor, Severus Alexander, was campaigning against Germanic tribes who had crossed the Rhine. He was young, only in his mid-20s, and he had ruled with the guidance of his mother, Julia Mamaea, who accompanied him on campaign. When Alexander negotiated with the Germanic chieftains and agreed to pay them tribute rather than fight a potentially costly battle, the army was outraged. This wasn't the Roman way. Rome didn't pay barbarians. Rome conquered them. The soldiers mutinied. They murdered both Alexander and his mother in their camp. And then, in a break with all precedent, they proclaimed as emperor not a senator or a member of the imperial family, but one of their own commanders, a man named Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, known to history as Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian. Maximinus was a soldier risen from the ranks, possibly of barbarian origin himself. He had never served in civil government. He'd never been to Rome. He would never go there. He ruled from the frontier, surrounded by soldiers, and his reign was maintained purely by military force. He was the first of what later historians would call the Baric emperors, rulers elevated by the army, accountable to no one but the army, and inevitably overthrown by the army. With Maximinus Thrax's acclamation, the Roman Empire entered its darkest period, a chaos that nearly destroyed it completely. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, and its story is where we turn next. The crisis of the 3rd century, an empire on the brink. The period from 235 AD to 284 AD is known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century, though it's also called the military anarchy or the imperial crisis. These names barely capture what it was like to live through those 50 years of disaster piled upon disaster. It was a time when the Roman Empire, which had seemed as permanent as the earth itself, nearly vanished from existence. Consider the numbers. From Augustus, the first emperor in 27 BC to the death of Severus Alexander in 235 AD, a period of about 260 years, the Roman Empire had seen 26 legitimate emperors. Some ruled for decades, some for only a few years. But on average, each emperor reigned for 10 years, providing continuity and stability. Now compare that to what came next. From 235 AD to 284 AD, a period of just 49 years, the empire saw at least 26 emperors, possibly more, depending on whether you count usurpers who controlled only part of the empire. That's roughly one emperor every 2 years, and most of them didn't retire peacefully. They were murdered by their own soldiers, killed in battle, or assassinated by rivals. This wasn't just political instability. It was institutional collapse. The very mechanisms that had held the empire together, the network of laws, administration, military discipline, and economic exchange, all of it began to fray and tear. Let's follow the cascade of disasters that define this period, beginning with Maximinus Thrax, that first Barbaric emperor. He ruled for 3 years, from 235 to 238 AD, and he never visited Rome, governing from military camps on the frontier. His reign was marked by constant warfare against Germanic tribes and harsh treatment of the Senate and wealthy citizens, whom he taxed heavily to pay his soldiers. The Senate, that ancient body that had once ruled the Republic and still maintained prestige if not real power, detested him. They saw him as a barbarian upstart, uncouth and illegitimate. In 238 AD, in the province of Africa, the governor proclaimed himself emperor. Within months, he was dead, killed in a revolt. His son, who had also been proclaimed emperor, was killed too. The Senate then proclaimed 2 elderly senators as co-emperors. Maximinus marched on Italy to crush this rebellion, but his troops, exhausted and frustrated by a difficult siege, murdered him outside the city of Aquileia. The 2 senatorial emperors entered Rome in triumph. Their reign lasted 99 days before they too were murdered by the Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguards in Rome, who had their own preferred candidate. This was 238 AD, later called the Year of the 6 Emperors, because 6 different men held or claimed the imperial title in a single year. It set the tone for what was to come. The constant civil wars had immediate effects. Armies marched and countermarched across the empire, not fighting barbarians but fighting each other. Provinces were stripped of their garrisons to support one claimant or another. Frontiers lay exposed, and the peoples beyond those frontiers, who had always pressed against Roman borders but been held back by Roman strength, now saw opportunity. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube in raids that penetrated deeper into Roman territory than they ever had before. These weren't organized invasions. They were opportunistic attacks by various tribal groups: Alemanni, Franks, Goths, Vandals, Saxons. Each sought plunder and glory. Roman cities that had never needed walls suddenly found themselves besieged. Agricultural lands were ravaged. Trade routes became too dangerous to travel. In the east, the situation was even worse. The Parthian Empire, Rome's old rival, had been overthrown in the 220s by a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids. Unlike the Parthians, who had been content with a loose confederation of vassal states, the Sassanids were centralized and aggressive. They saw themselves as the heirs to the ancient Persian Empire that had fought Greece centuries before, and they viewed the Romans as usurpers of territory that rightfully belonged to Persia. Under their king, Shapur I, the Sassanids launched devastating invasions into Roman territory in the east. They captured the strategic cities of Antioch and Nisibis. They raided deep into Syria and Asia Minor. And in 260 AD, they achieved something that shocked the Roman world to its core. They captured a Roman emperor. The Emperor Valerian, who had ruled since 253 AD, was campaigning against the Persians. He met Shapur to negotiate, possibly under a flag of truce. Shapur seized him and kept him prisoner. Valerian died in captivity. Persian sources claim he was humiliated, used as a human footstool when Shapur mounted his horse. Roman sources tried to downplay the catastrophe, but there was no avoiding it. This had never happened before. Rome's invincibility was revealed as myth. Valerian's son, Gallienus, continued as emperor in the West, but he faced an impossible situation. Usurpers rose throughout the empire. In Gaul, a general named Postumus proclaimed himself emperor and established what historians call the Gallic Empire, which controlled not just Gaul but also Britain and parts of Spain. This Gallic Empire would last from 260 to 274 AD, functioning as an independent state with its own emperors, armies, and administration. To the east, in Syria, a remarkable woman named Zenobia, ruling as regent for her young son, established the Pomeranian Empire, which at its height controlled Egypt and much of the eastern provinces. The Roman Empire had fractured into three competing states, each claiming to be the true Rome. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed. The constant warfare meant armies needed to be paid, and emperors, desperate for funds and competing for military loyalty, raised soldiers' pay dramatically. But the imperial treasury was empty. The mines that had once produced silver were running out. The response was to debase the currency further, mixing more and more base metal with less and less silver. Coins that had once been primarily silver became mostly copper or bronze with just a silver wash. Everyone knew this. Merchants refused to accept the coins at face value. Prices skyrocketed. Wages, paid in debased coins, bought less and less. This was inflation on a scale the ancient world had never seen. A measure of wheat that had cost a certain amount of denarii might cost 10 times that amount a decade later, 100 times that amount 2 decades later. Soldiers' pay, even though nominally increased, bought less with each year. This created a vicious cycle. Emperors needed to pay soldiers more to keep their loyalty. But the only way to pay them was to mint more coins. More coins meant worse inflation. Worse inflation meant soldiers needed more pay, and on and on. Trade broke down. The roads and sea lanes that had carried goods across the empire became dangerous. Pirates infested the Mediterranean. Brigands haunted the roads. Cities that had depended on imported grain faced famine. Urban populations declined as people fled to the countryside, hoping to survive by farming even small plots of land. Many didn't survive at all. For beyond the human-made disasters came a natural one. Around 250 AD, a devastating plague swept through the empire. It's known as the Plague of Cyprian after a Christian bishop who described it. Its exact nature is unknown. Some historians think it was smallpox. Others suggest measles or a form of hemorrhagic fever. Whatever it was, it killed indiscriminately and on a massive scale. Cities were hit especially hard. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with unburied corpses, the living too few to dispose of the dead. The population of the empire, already declining from war and economic collapse, plummeted further. The combination was nearly fatal. Military weakness, economic collapse, political anarchy, foreign invasions, disease. These weren't separate problems. They fed into each other, each making the others worse. The empire wasn't just declining, it was actively disintegrating. And yet it survived. Against all odds, the Roman Empire pulled itself back from the edge of extinction. The man who began this recovery was an emperor named Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 AD. Aurelian was another soldier emperor, but unlike most of the short-lived barrack emperors, he was genuinely talented. He understood that the empire's survival required reunification, and that reunification required military victory. He campaigned tirelessly. First, he defeated various Germanic tribes that had penetrated deep into the empire, driving them back beyond the frontiers. Then he turned east against the Pomeranian Empire. In a series of campaigns, He defeated Zenobia's armies, captured Palmyra, and brought Syria and Egypt back under Roman control. Zenobia herself was taken to Rome in chains, though Aurelian treated her with surprising respect afterward, granting her a villa and a pension. She lived out her life in comfortable retirement, a strange fate for someone who had nearly become an independent empress. Then Aurelian marched west against the Gallic Empire. In battles fought in Gaul, he destroyed the armies of Tetrarchus, the last Gallic emperor. By 274 AD, the empire was reunited under a single ruler for the first time in over a decade. Aurelian didn't just win battles. He reformed the currency, attempting to restore some value to the debased coinage. He fortified Rome itself, building the massive Aurelian walls that still stand today, a physical acknowledgement that even the city of Rome was no longer safe without defenses. He promoted the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a unifying religion that could bring together the empire's diverse peoples under one official worship. He was hailed as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But the problems ran too deep for one man to solve. In 275 AD, Aurelian was assassinated by his own officers, apparently due to a misunderstanding and conspiracy. His death showed that the fundamental problem, the lack of any legitimate system of succession, and the army's habit of murdering emperors, remained unresolved. The next few emperors continued Aurelian's policies, maintaining the reunited empire and trying to stabilize the economy and administration. But the empire they were maintaining was fundamentally different from what had existed before 235 AD. The cities were smaller and poorer. The economy was less monetized, with more transactions happening through barter. The military was larger but less disciplined, with more barbarian soldiers in its ranks. The government was more autocratic, with the emperor no longer pretending to be first among equals with the Senate but openly ruling as a dominus, a lord or master. The transformation from the Principate, the system established by Augustus, to the Dominate, the later style of imperial rule, was well underway. Finally, in 284 AD, a new emperor took power. His name was Diocles, though he would take the name Diocletian. He would rule for 21 years, longer than any emperor since the Severans, and he would implement reforms so thorough that they changed the nature of the Roman Empire forever. He didn't restore the old empire. He couldn't. That empire was gone. Instead, he created something new, something that could survive in the new world that the crisis of the 3rd century had created. The story of how he did that is where we turn next. Copy published The Fall of the Roman Empire, a slow decline. Diocletian's reforms, restructuring an empire. When Diocletian came to power in 284 AD, he inherited an empire that had nearly torn itself apart. The 50 years of chaos that became known as the crisis of the 3rd century had shown that the old system, the system Augustus had created nearly 3 centuries earlier, no longer worked. The empire was too vast, the threats too numerous, and the temptation for any general with an army at his back to march on the capital and seize power was too great. Something fundamental had to change. Diocletian understood this better than most. He was a practical man, not an idealist. Born Diocles in the Roman province of Dalmatia, probably to a family of modest means, he had risen through the military ranks through competence and determination. He had seen the empire at its weakest. He had witnessed emperors rise and fall in quick succession, each one murdered by the same soldiers who had elevated him. He had watched frontiers collapse and provinces break away. And when his own chance came to claim the purple, to become emperor, he did so not with dreams of glory but with a clear-eyed assessment of what needed to be done. The first and most obvious problem was simple geography and mathematics. One man could not be everywhere at once. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine River to the Sahara Desert. It had borders thousands of miles long, and enemies pressed against those borders from every direction. When a crisis erupted on the Danube frontier, the emperor might be campaigning in Syria. When Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, he might be dealing with a usurper in Egypt. By the time he could march his army from one end of the empire to the other, months had passed, and the damage was done. Diocletian's solution was radical but logical: divide the burden. In 285 AD, just a year after taking power, he appointed a fellow soldier named Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus, known as Maximian, as his Caesar. This was not entirely unprecedented. Marcus Aurelius had appointed Lucius Verus as co-emperor over a century earlier, but those earlier co-emperors had been members of the imperial family, bound by adoption or blood. Maximian was neither. He was simply a capable general, someone Diocletian trusted. This was government by merit, by necessity. The following year, Diocletian elevated Maximian to the rank of Augustus, making him not just a subordinate but a full co-emperor. Diocletian would rule the eastern half of the empire from his capital at Nicomedia, a city in northwestern Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Maximian would govern the west from Mediolanum, modern Milan in northern Italy. Rome itself, the ancient heart of the empire, was no longer an administrative capital. It remained symbolically important, still called the Eternal City, still home to the Senate. But the emperors now governed from cities closer to the frontiers, places where they could respond quickly to threats. This division into East and West was not meant to split the empire permanently. In theory, the Roman Empire remained one political entity, one patrimony, one undivided inheritance. The two Augusti were colleagues, not rivals. They issued laws jointly, appeared together on coins, and ruled in harmony. At least that was the plan. But Diocletian understood that even two emperors might not be enough. The empire was still too large, the crises too frequent. So in 293 AD, he took the next step. He appointed two more men, each with the title Caesar, junior emperors who would serve under the two Augusti and eventually succeed them. Diocletian chose a soldier named Galerius as his Caesar, based in Sirmium on the Danube frontier. Maximian selected Constantius, known as Constantius Chlorus, meaning Constantius the Pale, as his Caesar, based in Trier in Gaul. This was the tetrarchy, the rule of four. Each of the four rulers had responsibility for a specific region, and the military forces stationed there. Diocletian oversaw Thrace, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Galerius watched over the Danubian provinces and the Balkans. Maximian controlled Italy, Spain, and North Africa. Constantius governed Gaul, Britain, and the western frontiers. Together, these four men shared the enormous task of defending and administering the Roman world. It was an elegant solution, at least on paper. No longer would usurpers find it easy to seize power, because the death or removal of one emperor would not destabilize the entire government. No longer would frontiers go undefended while the emperor campaigned elsewhere. Each Augustus had his Caesar, ready to step up when the time came. And most importantly, the system was designed to avoid civil war over succession. When an Augustus retired or died, his Caesar would automatically become the new Augustus and would in turn appoint a new Caesar. Merit, not heredity, would determine who ruled. To strengthen this arrangement, Diocletian added an ideological dimension. He declared that he and Maximian were not merely mortal rulers but had been chosen by the gods. Diocletian took the name Jovius, associating himself with Jupiter, the king of the gods. Maximian became Herculeus, linking himself to Hercules, Jupiter's heroic son. The message was clear. The tetrarchs ruled by divine right. They were not simply generals who happened to have armies. They were the agents of providence, destined to restore order to the Roman world. This religious imagery served a practical purpose. It gave the tetrarchy legitimacy beyond military force. It suggested that to oppose Diocletian and his colleagues was to oppose the gods themselves. In an age when religion permeated every aspect of life, this was no small claim. Diocletian surrounded himself with elaborate ceremony and ritual. When he appeared in public, it was with pomp and grandeur that exceeded anything previous emperors had used. He wore purple robes stiff with gold embroidery, a diadem studded with gems, and he sat on a throne elevated above his courtiers. Those who approached him were required to prostrate themselves, to perform the act of proskenses, bowing until their foreheads touched the ground. This was a practice borrowed from the Persian court, and it scandalized traditional Roman sensibilities. Romans had always prided themselves on their republican heritage, on the idea that emperors were first among equals, not oriental despots. But Diocletian was not concerned with republican nostalgia. He was building a new kind of empire, one suited to the realities of the 4th century. The administrative reforms Diocletian enacted went far beyond the tetrarchy itself. He restructured the entire provincial system. Under Augustus and his successors, the empire had been divided into about 50 provinces, each governed by men who held both civil and military authority. This concentration of power in the hands of provincial governors had made it easy for ambitious men to rebel. All they needed to do was win the loyalty of their legions, and they could march on the capital. Diocletian broke this pattern by separating civil and military command. Provinces were divided into smaller units, roughly doubling their number to about 100. These new provinces were grouped into 12 larger administrative regions called dioceses, each overseen by a vicar who reported directly to the praetorian prefects, the highest-ranking officials below the emperors themselves. Meanwhile, military command was given to different officers, the duces and comites, who controlled the armies but had no civil authority. This made coordinated rebellion much harder. A general could no longer simply proclaim himself emperor and expect his province to follow. He would need to convince multiple officials across different chains of command, a far more difficult proposition. The army itself underwent massive expansion and reorganization. Diocletian and his colleagues understood that the borders could only be defended with a much larger military force. Estimates vary, but historians believe the army grew from perhaps 300,000 soldiers before Diocletian to somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 by the end of his reign. These new troops were deployed along the frontiers in networks of fortresses and strongpoints, creating a defense in depth that could absorb attacks and slow invaders. Diocletian also created a distinction that would define Roman military organization for the rest of the empire's existence. He divided the army into two categories: the limitanae, frontier troops who were permanently stationed along the borders and often given land to farm, making them part-time soldier farmers, and the comitatenses, mobile field armies that could march to wherever they were needed. This gave the empire flexibility. The limitanae served as a first line of defense, slowing any invasion. If they were overwhelmed, the comitatenses could arrive to destroy the invaders or drive them back. All of this required money, vast amounts of money. More soldiers meant more pay, more equipment, more supplies. A larger bureaucracy meant more officials to compensate. The elaborate ceremonies of the imperial court required funding. And the construction projects, the roads, the fortresses, the aqueducts, the public buildings that maintained Roman civilization, all of these costs continued. Diocletian responded with a comprehensive tax reform. He conducted a census throughout the empire, the most thorough since the time of Augustus, to determine exactly how much land existed and how many people lived on it. Based on this information, he established a new tax system called the annona, which assessed taxes on land and agricultural production. This was supplemented by the capitatio, a poll tax on individuals. The goal was to create a predictable revenue stream that would cover the empire's expenses. To ensure that taxes were collected reliably, Diocletian bound people to their occupations. If you were a farmer, a colonist working someone else's land, you were legally required to stay on that land. If you were a baker or a shipowner or belonged to any of the essential trades that supplied the cities and the army, you and your descendants were obliged to continue in that profession. This was not quite slavery, but it was hereditary obligation. Personal freedom was being sacrificed for the stability of the state. The rationale was simple enough. The empire needed food for its cities and armies. It needed goods transported. It needed artisans to produce weapons and armor. If people were free to abandon their farms or their trades whenever they wished, the whole system might collapse. So Diocletian, in his practical way, simply decreed that they could not abandon their posts. It was order imposed from above, a solution that prioritized collective security over individual liberty. These measures succeeded in stabilizing the empire, at least temporarily. The frontiers held. Usurpers were defeated. The provinces that had broken away were brought back under central control. Diocletian himself campaigned successfully against the Sarmatians and Carpi in the Danube region, against the Germans along the Rhine, and against rebels in Egypt. His Caesar Galerius fought a major war against the Sassanid Persians, and even sacked their capital at Ctesiphon, reversing the humiliation Rome had suffered decades earlier when Emperor Valerian was captured. By the early 300s, the Roman Empire seemed to have recovered. It was not the empire of Augustus or Trajan. It was more militarized, more bureaucratic, more authoritarian. Taxes were higher, freedom more restricted, and the old republican traditions had faded into distant memory. But it was stable. It was functioning. It could defend itself. Diocletian had given the empire what it desperately needed: time. Yet even as he stabilized the empire politically and militarily, Diocletian made one decision that would have profound consequences, one that would stain his legacy and accelerate forces he did not fully understand. In 303 AD, after nearly 20 years of generally tolerating the empire's diverse religions, he launched a persecution of Christians that would become the most severe in Roman history. The reasons for this persecution were complex. Christianity had been growing steadily throughout the 3rd century. By the time of Diocletian, Christians made up perhaps 5 to 10% of the empire's population, perhaps more in some regions. They were no longer a marginal sect confined to the urban poor. Christians could be found in all levels of society, in the army, in the bureaucracy, even in the imperial household. Diocletian's own wife, Prisca, and his daughter, Valeria, were rumored to be Christian sympathizers, though they kept their beliefs carefully hidden. But Christianity posed a problem for Diocletian's vision of the empire. His entire political theology was based on the idea that the emperors ruled with the favor of the traditional Roman gods, especially Jupiter and Hercules. The elaborate ceremonies he had instituted, the incense burned before imperial statues, the sacrifices performed in public, all of this reinforced the idea that the empire was divinely protected. Christians refused to participate. They would not burn incense before the emperor's image, calling it idolatry. They would not sacrifice to the Roman gods, insisting that such beings were demons or illusions. From the perspective of traditional Romans, This was not just theological disagreement. It was a threat to the Pax Romana, the peace with the gods that protected Rome. The immediate trigger for the persecution may have been an incident during a religious ceremony. Diocletian was consulting the auspices, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals to divine the will of the gods, when the haruspices, the priests who interpreted these signs, reported that the ritual had failed. They blamed the presence of Christians, who they claimed had made the sign of the cross, profaning the ceremony. Whether this actually happened or was merely a pretext, Galerius, Diocletian's Caesar and a fervent traditionalist, seized the opportunity to argue for action against the Christians. In February 303, Diocletian issued the first edict against Christians. It ordered the destruction of Christian churches and the burning of Christian scriptures. Christians were dismissed from government positions and lost certain legal rights. Further edicts followed throughout the year. Clergy were arrested and ordered to sacrifice to the Roman gods on pain of death. Eventually, the persecution was extended to all Christians, not just the clergy. Imperial officials went from city to city, demanding that citizens perform sacrifices. Those who refused were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The persecution varied in intensity depending on where you lived. In the western provinces, under Maximian and especially under Constantius, it was enforced half-heartedly. Constantius had Christians in his own household, and he limited his compliance to demolishing a few churches while generally leaving people alone. In the east, under Diocletian and especially under Galerius, the persecution was savage. Thousands were martyred. Churches were systematically destroyed. Christian books were seized and burned. Communities were scattered. Yet the persecution failed. Christianity was too widespread, too deeply rooted, and too resilient. Believers went underground, holding services in private homes or in the catacombs. Many Christians apostatized, renouncing their faith under torture, but many others stood firm, and their courage won admiration even from pagans. The persecution created more martyrs, and martyrdom had a strange way of inspiring faith rather than crushing it. By 305 AD, Diocletian was exhausted. He was in his 60s, which in that era made him an old man. He had ruled for 21 years, longer than most emperors in recent memory. His health was failing. Some sources suggest he suffered a stroke or a debilitating illness. He decided to do something that no Roman emperor had ever done before. He would retire voluntarily. On May 1, 305, in a public ceremony, Diocletian abdicated. He removed the purple robes, laid down the imperial insignia, and became a private citizen once more. He convinced Maximian to do the same. The two Augusti stepped down, and as planned, their Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, became the new Augusti. Two new Caesars were appointed, Severus in the west and Maximinus Daia in the east. The tetrarchy would continue. Diocletian retired to a massive palace he had built at Spalatum, modern split on the coast of Dalmatia. It was a palace like no other, covering nearly 10 acres, with walls as thick as a fortress, enclosed gardens, temples, and luxurious apartments. He spent his remaining years there, reportedly tending to his gardens and refusing to be drawn back into politics. When civil wars broke out after his retirement, when the tetrarchy fell apart and rivals fought for control, Diocletian was urged by some to return and restore order. He refused. He had done his part. He had given the empire 21 years of stability, longer than anyone in living memory. If his successors destroyed what he had built, that was no longer his responsibility. He died around 311 or 312 AD, exactly when is uncertain. By then, the system he had created was collapsing, and the empire was once again sliding toward civil war. But for a few years, Diocletian had proved that it was possible to restore order, that the empire could be governed, that collapse was not inevitable. His reforms created structures that would last for centuries. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, the separation of civil and military authority, the expanded bureaucracy, the professional army, all of these became permanent features of the later Roman Empire. Yet for all his achievements, Diocletian could not solve the fundamental problem: how to ensure a peaceful succession. The tetrarchy assumed that emperors would willingly retire and that their successors would be chosen for competence rather than heredity. This assumption, it turned out, was hopelessly naive. Human beings do not easily relinquish power, and fathers do not easily accept that their sons should not inherit their positions. When Constantius Chlorus died in July 306, less than 2 years after becoming Augustus, his troops immediately proclaimed his son Constantine as the new emperor. This violated the entire principle of the tetrarchy. Constantine was not the designated Caesar. He had not been chosen by merit. He was simply the son of the previous emperor, elevated by soldiers who wanted a leader they knew. And once that precedent was set, others followed. Maxentius, the son of Maximian, seized power in Rome. Maximian himself came out of retirement. Within a year, there were 6 men claiming to be emperor. The Second Tetrarchy lasted barely a year before dissolving into chaos. The system Diocletian had built required a guiding hand, someone with the authority and will to hold it together. Without Diocletian, that hand was absent, and so the empire plunged back into civil war, rival Augusti and Caesars fighting each other across the Mediterranean world. It would take another 2 decades and countless battles before one man, Constantine, emerged victorious and united the empire under his sole rule. But that victory, when it came, would bring changes Diocletian could never have anticipated. Constantine would embrace the very religion Diocletian had tried to destroy. And in doing so, Constantine would transform not just the Roman Empire, but the entire course of Western civilization. Constantine and the triumph of Christianity. The collapse of Diocletian's tetrarchy after his retirement set the stage for yet another round of civil wars. But the conflicts that erupted in the years following 305 AD were different from the military anarchy of the 3rd century. These wars would not just determine who ruled the empire. They would determine what the empire would become and what role religion would play in its future. When Constantius Chlorus died in the northern British city of Eboracum, modern York, in July 306, his legions immediately proclaimed his son Constantine as Augustus. Constantine was young, probably in his early 30s, but he had served with his father on campaigns and had won the loyalty of the troops. According to later Christian writers, Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian or at least sympathetic to Christianity, though this may have been exaggerated after the fact. Constantine himself was raised in the traditional Roman religion, worshipping the pantheon of gods, but he seems to have had a particular devotion to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a solar deity who had become increasingly popular in the late empire. Constantine's elevation violated Diocletian's careful succession plan. He was not the designated Caesar. The proper successor in the West should have been Severus, who had been appointed Caesar when Constantius became Augustus. But armies cared little for constitutional niceties. They followed commanders they trusted, and they trusted Constantine. Galerius, now the senior Augustus in the East, grudgingly recognized Constantine, but only as a Caesar, not as an Augustus. It was a compromise that pleased no one and ensured further conflict. Meanwhile, in Rome, another complication arose. Maxentius, the son of the retired Emperor Maximian, seized power in the city. He had been passed over in the succession, despite his father's former rank, and he resented it. Maxentius declared himself Augustus, and Maximian came out of retirement to support his son. The situation rapidly became confused. At various points between 306 and 312, there were as many as 6 or 7 different men claiming to be legitimate emperors or Caesars. The elderly Diocletian, living in his palace at Spalatum, watched from a distance as the system he had created fell apart. He was asked more than once to return and restore order, to arbitrate between the rival claimants. He refused. He had retired, he said, and he would not be drawn back into the chaos. According to one possibly apocryphal story, when envoys came to plead with him to resume power, he told them that if they could see the vegetables he was growing in his garden, they would understand why he had no interest in returning to the dangerous game of imperial politics. By 312, the field had narrowed. In the west, Constantine controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Maxentius held Italy and North Africa. In the east, Licinius and Maximinus Daia competed for supremacy. Constantine decided the time had come to eliminate Maxentius and unify the Western Empire under his control. Constantine's campaign in 312 was swift and decisive. He marched his army south through Gaul and across the Alps into northern Italy. Maxentius's forces tried to stop him at several points, but were defeated each time. By late October, Constantine had reached the outskirts of Rome itself. Maxentius could have stayed behind the city's massive walls and waited for Constantine to exhaust himself in a siege. Rome was well fortified, and its supplies could last for months. But Maxentius, perhaps overconfident, perhaps pressured by the Roman Senate and people who were tired of his erratic rule, decided to march out and fight a pitched battle. The two armies met on October 28, 312, near the Milvian Bridge, which carried the Via Flaminia across the Tiber River just north of the city. It was a position fraught with risk for Maxentius, because his army had the river at its back. If his troops broke and tried to retreat, they would have to cross the bridge or find another way over the water. There would be no easy escape. What happened next became one of the most famous and debated events in Roman history. According to later Christian accounts, most notably those written by Lactantius, a Christian tutor in Constantine's court, and Eusebius of Caesarea, a Christian bishop and historian, Constantine had a vision on the eve of the battle. The accounts differ in details, but the core story is consistent. Constantine saw a sign in the sky, either a cross of light or the Chi symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. With this sign, or hovering above it, appeared words that in Latin became "in hoc signo vinces," meaning in this sign, you will conquer. Constantine took this as a message from the Christian God. The next morning, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi symbol on their shields. This was revolutionary. The Roman army had always fought under the standards of the legion, the silver eagles that symbolized Roman power and the favor of the traditional gods. No Roman emperor had ever ordered his troops to carry Christian symbols into battle, but Constantine did. The battle itself was decisive. Constantine's forces pushed Maxentius's army back toward the Tiber. Maxentius tried to order a retreat, but in the chaos, a temporary pontoon bridge that had been constructed alongside the Milvian Bridge collapsed under the weight of soldiers trying to cross. Men fell into the river, weighed down by armor, and drowned. Maxentius was among them. His body was recovered from the Tiber the next day. His head was cut off and paraded through the streets of Rome on a spear as Constantine entered the city in triumph. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God. Whether his vision was real, a psychological experience, a calculated political move, or a later invention by Christian propagandists, We cannot know for certain. What matters is that Constantine believed it, or at least claimed to believe it, and that belief changed the course of history. Modern historians have debated Constantine's sincerity for centuries. Was his conversion genuine, a moment of spiritual transformation on the eve of battle? Or was it cynical political calculation, recognizing that Christians, though still a minority, were numerous, well-organized, and could provide a powerful base of support? The truth may lie somewhere between. Constantine may have had a genuine spiritual experience, but he also understood its political utility. Religion and politics were inseparable in the ancient world, and Constantine was a master of both. Whatever his motivations, Constantine's actions in the years following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge were consistent with a ruler who favored Christianity. He did not immediately ban traditional Roman religion. That would come much later. Instead, he pursued a policy of toleration and gradually increasing support for the Christian Church. In 313, Constantine met with Licinius, who had emerged victorious in the east after defeating Maximinus Daia. Together, they issued what became known as the Edict of Milan. This was not a single formal document, but rather a series of pronouncements and letters that established a new policy. All religions would be tolerated throughout the empire. Christians, who had been persecuted as recently as a decade earlier, would have full legal rights. Their confiscated property would be returned. They could worship openly. Other religions, including the traditional Roman gods, would also be tolerated. It was a policy of religious pluralism, remarkable for its time. But Constantine went further. He began to actively support the Christian Church in ways no emperor ever had. He exempted Christian clergy from certain taxes and civic obligations. He funded the construction of large churches in Rome and other cities, including the original St. Peter's Basilica on Vatican Hill, built over what Christians believed was the tomb of the Apostle Peter. He donated imperial land and money to Christian communities. He promoted Christians to positions of influence in the government and the army, though he was careful not to alienate the pagan majority completely. Constantine also involved himself in theological disputes within the church. Christianity, it turned out, was not a unified faith. Different Christian communities disagreed, sometimes bitterly, about doctrine, authority, and practice. One of the most serious conflicts was the Arian controversy, named after Arius, a priest in Alexandria who taught that Jesus Christ, while divine, was a created being and therefore subordinate to God the Father. This view was opposed by other Christians, notably Athanasius, also of Alexandria, who insisted that Jesus was co-eternal and co-equal with the Father, of the same divine substance. To outsiders, these might have seemed like obscure theological quibbles, but to the Christians involved, they were fundamental questions about the nature of God. And when Christians began fighting each other in the streets, when bishops excommunicated rival bishops and communities split into factions, Constantine saw a threat to the unity he was trying to build. In 325, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church. Bishops from across the empire gathered in the city of Nicaea in Asia Minor to debate and resolve the Arian controversy. Constantine presided over the council, though he was not baptized and was not a member of the church in a formal sense. He urged the bishops to reach a consensus. After weeks of debate, the council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that declared Jesus to be true God from true God, begotten not made, of one substance with the Father. Arianism was condemned as heresy, though the controversy would continue for decades. Constantine's involvement in the council showed that he saw Christianity as more than just another religion. He saw it as a unifying force, a way to bring together the diverse peoples of the empire under a shared belief system. The old Roman gods had worked for centuries, but they were local, tribal, and fragmented. Christianity was universal, offering salvation to all people regardless of their ethnicity or social status. For an emperor trying to hold together a vast, multicultural empire, this had obvious appeal. Constantine's conversion and support for Christianity had profound effects, but it did not immediately transform the empire. The majority of the population remained pagan. The Senate in Rome was overwhelmingly pagan. The army, though it had followed Constantine under the Christian banner at the Milvian Bridge, was largely pagan. Constantine could not simply decree that everyone become Christian, nor did he try. Instead, he pursued a gradual policy of favoring Christians while tolerating pagans, hoping that over time, Christianity would become the dominant faith through persuasion and social pressure rather than force. In 324, Constantine defeated Licinius in a final civil war and became the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire, both east and west. He was now in a position no emperor had held since Diocletian's reforms 30 years earlier. He ruled alone, with no co-Augustus, no tetrarchy. The empire was united under one man. One of Constantine's most consequential decisions came in 330, when he inaugurated a new capital for the empire. The city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia, was rebuilt, massively expanded, and renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. This new capital was Christian from the beginning. There were no pagan temples built in Constantinople. Instead, Constantine filled it with churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia. The city's very design reflected the new religious orientation of the empire. Rome remained important symbolically, and it was still called the capital, but the center of political power had shifted east. The Senate continued to meet in Rome, and emperors made occasional visits, but the administrative heart of the empire was now Constantinople. This shift would have lasting consequences. It placed the emperor closer to the wealthy eastern provinces, to the Persian frontier, and to the Danube, where threats were constant. It also began the long process by which the eastern and western halves of the empire would drift apart, developing different cultures, different priorities, and eventually different fates. Constantine ruled until his death in 337. Only on his deathbed was he baptized, finally becoming a full member of the church he had supported for 25 years. This deathbed baptism was not unusual. Many Christians in this era delayed baptism until late in life, believing that it washed away all sins and that sinning after baptism was particularly grievous. By waiting until the end, Constantine ensured he would die in a state of grace. His reign left the empire transformed. Christianity had gone from a persecuted sect to the emperor's favored religion. Churches were being built with imperial funds. Bishops wielded influence at court. Christian theology was being debated at councils attended by the emperor himself. The process was not yet complete. Pagan temples still stood. The old gods were still worshipped, but the direction was clear. Within a few generations, Christianity would become not just favored but mandatory, and the old Roman religion would fade into memory. But Constantine's conversion and the rise of Christianity were only one thread in the complex story of the empire's transformation. While theological debates raged in the East and new churches rose in Constantinople, the western provinces faced growing pressure from peoples beyond the frontiers, peoples the Romans dismissively called barbarians. These peoples were not content to simply raid and retreat as they had in the past. Increasingly, they were seeking to enter the empire permanently, to settle on Roman land and, in some cases, to carve out kingdoms of their own. The story of how the Roman Empire fell is inseparable from the story of these migrations, these invasions, these encounters between Roman and barbarian that would ultimately transform Europe entirely. The barbarian invasions, pressure on the frontiers. To understand how the Western Roman Empire fell, we need to understand who the so-called barbarians were, why they came, and what happened when they arrived. The Romans used the word barbarus to describe anyone who did not speak Greek or Latin, anyone who lived outside the empire's borders and did not share Roman culture. It was not necessarily a term of contempt, at least not initially. It simply meant other, foreign, different. But over time, especially as conflicts intensified, it came to carry connotations of savagery, lack of civilization, and threat. The barbarian peoples who played the largest role in the fall of the Western Empire were primarily Germanic tribes from the regions north and east of the Rhine and Danube rivers. These included the Goths, who themselves were divided into Visigoths, meaning Western Goths, and Ostrogoths, meaning Eastern Goths. There were the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Saxons, the Angles, the Lombards, and many others. Each of these groups had its own language, customs, and social structure, though they shared broad cultural similarities. These peoples were not primitive savages living in crude huts, as Roman propaganda sometimes suggested. They had sophisticated metalworking, complex social hierarchies, rich oral traditions, and an increasingly organized political structure. Many of them had been trading with Rome for centuries. Roman merchants traveled beyond the frontiers to exchange goods. Roman diplomats negotiated treaties. Roman generals recruited barbarian warriors to serve as auxiliary troops in the legions. By the 4th century, the line between Roman and barbarian had become blurred. There were barbarians living inside the empire, serving in the army and rising to high rank. There were Romans living beyond the borders, sometimes as hostages, sometimes as advisors to tribal chiefs. But starting in the late 4th century, something changed. The barbarians were no longer content with raids or mercenary service. They began to move in large numbers, entire tribes migrating together, seeking land on which to settle permanently. These migrations were not simply opportunistic invasions taking advantage of Roman weakness, though that was part of it. They were also desperate flights from a terrifying new threat that had appeared from the east, the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people, probably originating from the steppes of Central Asia, who swept into Eastern Europe in the 370s. They were superb horsemen and archers, and their tactics, sudden raids by mounted warriors who appeared without warning, shot volleys of arrows, and then vanished before infantry could respond, were unlike anything the Europeans had encountered. The Huns were not interested in settling down and farming. They wanted tribute, plunder, and control. They conquered or terrorized the peoples in their path, and those peoples, faced with subjugation or destruction, moved west into Roman territory. The first major group to arrive were the Goths. In 376 AD, a large body of Goths, perhaps as many as 200,000 people including women and children, appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River. They had been driven from their lands by the advancing Huns. Their leaders sent envoys to the Roman emperor, Valens, asking permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. They offered to serve in the Roman army and to farm Roman land. In exchange, they wanted protection and a place to live. Valens agreed. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The empire needed soldiers, and here were thousands of warriors ready to fight. The empire could always use more troops along its extensive frontiers, and the Goths would be settled in the Balkans, a region that needed more agricultural workers and defenders. It should have worked. But Roman officials on the ground, corrupt and greedy, saw an opportunity for profit rather than an opportunity to help desperate refugees. The Goths were forced to wait on the northern bank of the Danube for weeks while officials extorted bribes to allow them across. When they were finally permitted to cross, they were cheated at every turn. Roman merchants sold them food at inflated prices. Some officials even sold them dog meat, claiming it was beef. The Goths had been promised land and supplies. Instead, they found exploitation and contempt. Hungry, angry, and feeling betrayed, the Goths rebelled in 377 AD. What had been a peaceful migration turned into a military crisis. Gothic warriors, battle-hardened and now desperate, began raiding Roman towns and farms in the Balkans. They defeated local Roman forces sent against them. The situation spiraled out of control rapidly. Emperor Valens, who had been campaigning in the east against the Persians, marched west with his army to deal with the Gothic threat personally. The two sides met on August 9, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople in Thrace. It was a hot summer day. Valens had perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers. The Goths had a similar number of warriors, but crucially, they had cavalry support from other Gothic groups that arrived during the battle. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. The Roman infantry, exhausted from marching in the heat and caught off guard by the Gothic cavalry charge, began to collapse. The Gothic horsemen surrounded portions of the Roman army and systematically destroyed them. It was a massacre. 2/3 of the Roman army was killed. Valens himself died in the battle, though his body was never found. According to one account, though the exact circumstances remain uncertain, he was wounded and carried to a farmhouse, which the Goths then set on fire, possibly burning the emperor alive. Other accounts suggest different scenarios, but all agree he perished in the battle, and his body was never recovered. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, comparable to Cannae, when Hannibal had nearly destroyed Rome's army 6 centuries earlier. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople was panic. The Goths were now a victorious army roaming freely through the Balkans. They besieged cities, though they lacked the equipment and skill for sustained sieges. They looted the countryside. And most importantly, they proved that Roman legions were not invincible, that disciplined barbarian warriors could defeat Rome's best troops in open battle. Valens was succeeded by Theodosius, a capable general from Spain, who became emperor in 379 AD. Theodosius understood that the empire could not simply defeat the Goths militarily. There were too many of them, they fought too well, and the empire could not afford to lose more armies in battles like Adrianople. So Theodosius negotiated. In 382 AD, he reached an agreement with the Gothic leaders. The Goths would be allowed to settle in Thrace as foederati, federated allies. They would keep their own leaders and their own laws. They would not pay Roman taxes. In exchange, they would provide military service to the empire when called upon. This treaty was a turning point. For the first time, a large barbarian group had been settled inside the empire, maintaining its identity rather than being absorbed into Roman culture. The Goths were in the empire, but not of it. They were allies, but allies who maintained their own separate existence, their own military forces, their own leadership structure. It was a pragmatic solution to an immediate crisis, but it set a dangerous precedent. Other barbarian groups would see this arrangement and demand similar treatment. The empire's borders were becoming porous, not because Roman defenses were being overwhelmed, but because Rome was willingly allowing barbarians to settle inside those borders. Theodosius ruled until 395 AD. He was the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire, both east and west, as a single political unit. When he died, he divided the empire between his two young sons. Arcadius, who was about 18, received the eastern half and ruled from Constantinople. Honorius, who was only about 11, received the western half. Honorius was initially based in Milan, the traditional capital of the Western Empire, but would later move the capital to Ravenna, a more defensible city on the Adriatic coast. This division was not intended to be permanent. In theory, the empire was still one, just as it had been under Diocletian's tetrarchy. The two emperors were supposed to cooperate to help each other against external threats and internal rebellions. But in practice, the division became permanent almost immediately. The two halves of the empire began to diverge. They had different priorities, different challenges, and increasingly different cultures. The East, wealthier and more urbanized, centered on Constantinople, began to develop what would eventually become Byzantine civilization. The West, poorer and more rural, faced increasing barbarian pressure and internal decay. The Western Empire, under the boy Emperor Honorius, was effectively ruled by his military commander, a general named Stilicho. Stilicho was himself of barbarian origin. His father had been a Vandal, but he had risen through the ranks of the Roman army and was fiercely loyal to the empire and to the family of Theodosius, whose niece he had married. Stilicho was a capable general and administrator, but he faced an impossible situation. The Western Empire's resources were strained. Its armies were undermanned and increasingly recruited from barbarian foederati rather than Roman citizens. Its economy was struggling under the burden of taxes needed to support the military and the bureaucracy, and it faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously. In 401 AD, a new crisis emerged. A Gothic leader named Alaric, who had served under Theodosius and had been given the title of Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers in the Eastern Empire, now turned his attention westward. Alaric led his Gothic followers, somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 warriors plus their families, into Italy. He demanded that Honorius grant him land and official status within the Western Empire. When Honorius refused, Alaric besieged cities in northern Italy. Stilicho managed to defeat Alaric in two battles, at Palencia in 402 and at Verona in 403, forcing the Goths to withdraw from Italy. But Stilicho could not destroy Alaric's forces completely. The Gothic army remained intact, and Alaric remained a threat, hovering just beyond the Alps, waiting for another opportunity. Meanwhile, other barbarian groups were taking advantage of the chaos. On the last day of December, 406 AD, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi crossed the frozen Rhine River into Gaul. The Rhine frontier, which had held for centuries, suddenly collapsed. These tribes swept through Gaul, meeting little organized resistance. Cities were sacked. Farms were looted. The Roman administration in Gaul essentially disintegrated. By 409, these barbarian groups had crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, where they would carve out kingdoms of their own. Also in 406, Roman troops in Britain proclaimed one of their generals, a man named Constantine, though not related to Constantine the Great, as emperor. Constantine crossed into Gaul with his army to assert his claim, leaving Britain essentially undefended. The Romano-British population would be left to fend for themselves against raids by Picts from the north and Saxons from across the North Sea. Rome would never effectively re-establish control over Britain. The island that had been Roman for over 3.5 centuries was now cut off from the empire. Stilicho tried desperately to hold things together, but he faced suspicion and jealousy from many in the Roman Senate and court who distrusted him because of his barbarian heritage. In 408, while Stilicho was dealing with yet another crisis, enemies at Honorius's court convinced the young emperor that Stilicho was planning to put his own son on the throne. Honorius ordered Stilicho's arrest. Stilicho, who might have resisted, who commanded loyal troops and could have fought, instead submitted. He was executed on August 22, 408. The murder of Stilicho was a catastrophic mistake. He had been the only competent military leader the Western Empire had. With him gone, and with anti-barbarian riots breaking out in Italy that killed the families of many barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army, those soldiers deserted en masse and joined Alaric. Alaric, now commanding a much larger force and facing no effective opposition, marched on Rome itself. In 408, he besieged the Eternal City. Rome had not been besieged by a foreign enemy for 800 years, not since the Gauls had sacked it in 390 BC. The psychological impact was enormous. The Senate negotiated with Alaric, paying him an enormous ransom in gold, silver, and other valuables to lift the siege. Alaric withdrew but remained in Italy, demanding that Honorius, safe behind the marshes and walls of Ravenna, negotiate a permanent settlement. The negotiations dragged on through 409 and into 410. Honorius, perhaps influenced by court officials who were more concerned with palace intrigue than with barbarian invasions, refused to make concessions. Alaric's patience ran out. In August 410, he marched on Rome for a third time. On August 24, 410, the gates were opened, possibly by sympathizers inside the city or by slaves hoping for freedom. Alaric's Goths entered Rome and sacked it for 3 days. The sack of Rome, which began on August 24, 410 AD, was not as destructive as it might have been. Alaric was a Christian, and he ordered his troops to respect churches and church property. There was looting, certainly, and violence, but it was not the wholesale massacre and destruction that the word sack might imply. Still, the psychological shock was profound. Rome, the heart of the empire, the eternal city, had been violated. Saint Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, expressed the horror that educated Romans throughout the empire felt. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. For Christians, the sack raised troubling questions. Rome had been pagan for most of its history, but for a century now, since Constantine, it had been officially Christian. God had supposedly blessed the Christian empire. So why had God allowed Rome to fall to barbarians? The pagan minority in Rome argued that the city's defeat was punishment for abandoning the old gods who had protected Rome for 1,000 years. Christians struggled to answer. One of the most important Christian responses came from Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history. In response to the sack, Augustine spent 13 years writing a massive work called The City of God. In it, he argued that earthly cities, even Rome, were temporary and imperfect. The true Christian citizenship was in the city of God, a spiritual kingdom that could never fall. Earthly empires rose and fell according to God's inscrutable plan, but the faithful should not despair, because their true home was eternal. It was a profound theological statement that would shape Christian thought for centuries, but it also represented a fundamental shift in thinking. Romans had always believed that Rome itself was eternal, that the empire would last forever. Now, a leading Christian thinker was saying that perhaps it didn't matter if Rome fell, that Christians should focus on the next world rather than this one. Alaric himself did not live to see what would come of his sack of Rome. After leaving the city, he marched south, possibly intending to cross to Sicily and from there to Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. But he fell ill and died in late 410, probably from fever. His followers buried him in the bed of a river, temporarily diverting the water, placing his body and his treasures in the riverbed, then redirecting the water back over the grave so that it could never be found and looted. The location remains a mystery to this day. Alaric's successor, Ataulf, led the Goths out of Italy and into southern Gaul and Spain. Eventually, after more years of negotiation and conflict, the Visigoths were settled by treaty in southwestern Gaul, establishing what would become the Visigothic kingdom with its capital eventually at Tolosa, modern Toulouse. Like the earlier settlement of Goths in Thrace, this was a federate arrangement. The Visigoths maintained their own kings, their own laws, and their own military, while nominally serving as allies of Rome. But the Western Empire was collapsing rapidly. By 420, Roman control in Gaul was limited to a few regions. Britain was entirely lost. Spain was divided among various barbarian kingdoms. North Africa remained Roman, but it too would soon be threatened. The Vandals, who had established themselves in southern Spain, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa in 429 under their king, Gizeric. Over the next decade, they conquered the wealthy provinces of North Africa, including Carthage, which fell in 439. The loss of North Africa was a devastating blow. These provinces had been the empire's breadbasket, providing the grain that fed Rome and other Italian cities. The tax revenues from these wealthy provinces had been crucial to the imperial treasury. Now they were gone, controlled by a barbarian kingdom that cared nothing for Rome's needs. The Vandals did not stop with Africa. They built a fleet and became pirates, raiding coastal cities throughout the western Mediterranean. In 455, they sailed up the Tiber River and sacked Rome again, carrying off massive amounts of treasure and thousands of captives, including the empress and her daughters. This second sack was more thorough than Alaric's. The very word vandalism, meaning willful destruction, comes from this event, though modern historians point out that the Vandals were actually quite organized in their looting, rather than simply destructive. Through the mid-5th century, the Western Empire continued to fragment. Various barbarian kingdoms solidified their control over what had been Roman provinces. The Visigoths in southern Gaul and Spain, the Vandals in North Africa, the Burgundians along the Rhone River, the Franks in northern Gaul, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in Britain. Italy itself remained nominally under imperial control, but the emperors were puppet figures, controlled by barbarian generals who held the real power. These barbarian kingdoms were not necessarily hostile to Roman civilization. Many barbarian kings admired Roman culture and tried to preserve it. They employed Roman administrators to help govern. They issued coins in the Roman style. They maintained Roman law for their Roman subjects, while their own people lived under tribal law. The Catholic Church, which had grown powerful and wealthy over the past century, continued to function and even expanded its influence. In many ways, these kingdoms were successor states to Rome, not its antithesis. But the Western Empire as a unified political structure was dead. The emperors in Italy controlled only Italy and parts of the Balkans, and even there their authority was questionable. They relied on barbarian troops and barbarian generals. They had no independent power base. The Eastern Empire, meanwhile, survived and even flourished. Constantinople was wealthy, well-defended, and ruled by increasingly capable emperors. The East had better natural defenses, wealthier cities, and a more monetized economy. It also had the advantage of geography. The barbarian migrations from the north and east tended to move westward. The Eastern Empire faced threats, certainly, but nothing like the cascade of invasions that overwhelmed the West. In the West, a series of shadow emperors came and went through the 450s and 460s. Real power lay with military strongmen, generals who made and unmade emperors at will. The most powerful of these was Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans. Oedius was a skilled diplomat and general who managed to maintain some semblance of Roman authority in Gaul through a complex network of alliances with various barbarian kingdoms. In 451, he won a major victory at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in Gaul, defeating an invasion by Attila the Hun. Attila, the most feared warrior of his age, had united the Huns and their subject peoples into a massive confederation, and had been ravaging the Eastern Empire before turning west. Oedius, commanding an army that was itself mostly composed of barbarian foederati, including Visigoths and Franks, managed to stop Attila's advance. But Oedius's success made him dangerous to the Emperor Valentinian III. In 454, Valentinian, perhaps fearing Oedius's power, personally murdered him during a meeting, stabbing him to death. It was an act of supreme stupidity. Oedius had been the only competent military leader the Western Empire had left. A contemporary chronicler wrote that Valentinian had cut off his right hand with his left. The following year, Valentinian himself was assassinated by Oedius's supporters. The Western Empire now entered its final phase. A series of emperors, most of them controlled by barbarian generals, reigned briefly and ineffectually. The real power in Italy during the 460s and 470s was held by Ricimer, a general of mixed Visigothic and Suevic ancestry, who made and murdered emperors as it suited him. After Ricimer's death in 472, other barbarian generals continued the pattern. By 475, the Western Empire was a shadow. It controlled only Italy, and even there its authority was limited. That year, a general named Orestes, a Roman who had once served as secretary to Attila the Hun, seized power in Italy. Orestes decided to make his teenage son emperor. The boy's name was Romulus, the same as Rome's legendary founder, and he was given the nickname Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, a diminutive that was both affectionate and mocking. Romulus Augustulus was not recognized by the Eastern Empire. To them, the legitimate Western emperor was Julius Nepos, who had been deposed by Orestes and had fled to Dalmatia. But in Italy, Romulus Augustulus was proclaimed emperor on October 31, 475. He was probably about 14 years old. He had no real power. His father, Orestes, governed in his name. Orestes commanded a largely barbarian army. These troops demanded what other barbarian groups had received: land in Italy to settle on, 1/3 of the agricultural land to be distributed to the soldiers. Orestes refused. He was willing to employ barbarians as soldiers, but he would not turn Italy itself over to barbarian settlement. Italy was the heart of the empire, the sacred soil of Rome. It could not be given away like Gaul or Spain had been. The troops mutinied. They turned to one of their commanders, a man named Odoacer, whose father had been an official in Attila's court and who himself was of mixed Syrian, Herulian, and perhaps other Germanic ancestry. In August 476, Odoacer's troops marched on Ravenna. Orestes fled but was captured and executed. Ravenna surrendered without much of a fight. Odoacer had no interest in making himself emperor. The title had become meaningless. Instead, on September 4, 476 AD, he simply deposed Romulus Augustulus. The boy was sent into retirement with a pension, allowed to live peacefully on an estate in Campania. He disappears from history after that. Some sources suggest he lived into the 510s, an old man who had once been emperor of Rome but whose reign no one remembered or cared about. Odoacer then did something extraordinary. He sent a message to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, who ruled from Constantinople. Odoacer explained that the West no longer needed its own emperor. Zeno was the legitimate emperor of the entire Roman Empire, both East and West. Odoacer would govern Italy as Zeno's representative, as a patricius, a patrician and military commander in Zeno's service. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, to Constantinople as a symbolic gesture of reunification. Zeno accepted this arrangement, at least nominally. He recognized Odoacer as his representative in Italy, though he also continued to recognize Julius Nepos, still alive in Dalmatia, as the legitimate Western emperor. It was a confusing situation, but it hardly mattered. The Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist as an independent political entity. The date traditionally given for the fall of Rome is September 4, 476 AD, the day Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. But as we have seen, this was not a sudden catastrophe. It was the final, quiet end of a process that had been ongoing for decades, even centuries. The Western Empire had been fragmenting for generations. Its territory had been shrinking. Its power had been fading. By 476, there was almost nothing left to fall. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was simply the moment when everyone stopped pretending that the Western Empire still existed. Odoacer ruled Italy for 17 years. He governed fairly effectively, maintaining order, working with the Roman Senate, and preserving much of the existing administrative structure. Life in Italy did not change dramatically for most people. The same landlords owned the same estates. The same merchants traded the same goods. The Catholic Church continued its work. Latin remained the language of administration and culture. To the average person, the fact that there was no longer a Western Roman emperor might have seemed like a minor administrative detail. But in the East, in Constantinople, the emperors never forgot. They continued to claim authority over the entire Roman Empire, including the West, and eventually they would try to reconquer what had been lost. In the 530s, the Eastern Emperor Justinian launched campaigns to retake North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths who had conquered it from Odoacer, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. These campaigns were partially successful. North Africa and Italy were reconquered, though at enormous cost and with devastating effects on the local populations. But these reconquests did not restore the Western Empire. They simply placed those territories under the rule of Constantinople, and that rule would not last. Within a few decades, new invaders, the Lombards in Italy and the Muslims in North Africa, would overrun most of Justinian's conquests. The Western Roman Empire was gone. It would never be restored. Europe had entered what later historians would call the early Middle Ages, a period of political fragmentation, economic decline, and cultural transformation. The barbarian kingdoms that had established themselves on the ruins of Rome would evolve into medieval kingdoms. The Franks would create an empire under Charlemagne that consciously tried to revive Roman imperial traditions. The Catholic Church would become the primary preserver of Roman culture and literacy. Latin would continue as the language of learning and religion throughout Western Europe. Roman law would form the basis of legal systems. The idea of Rome, the memory of Rome, would haunt European consciousness for over 1,000 years. But the reality of Rome, the unified Mediterranean Empire, the legions on the frontiers, the roads connecting Britain to Egypt, the single currency and single legal system that was finished. The world Rome had created was gone, transformed into something new. Why did Rome fall? The search for causes. For over 1,500 years, historians have debated why the Roman Empire fell. The question seems simple, but the answer is maddeningly complex. There is no single cause, no one event we can point to and say, this is why Rome fell. Instead, there are dozens of contributing factors, each interacting with the others in ways that are difficult to untangle. Let's explore some of the most important explanations that historians have proposed. understanding that most modern scholars believe the fall resulted from a combination of these factors, rather than any single cause. One of the earliest and most persistent theories focuses on barbarian invasions. This explanation argues that Rome fell because it was overwhelmed by external enemies, by the Germanic tribes who crossed the frontiers and established their own kingdoms on Roman territory. There is obvious truth to this. The Western Empire did fragment under barbarian pressure. Cities were sacked, provinces were lost, Roman administration collapsed. But this explanation raises as many questions as it answers. Why did the barbarians succeed in the 4th and 5th centuries when they had been held off for hundreds of years previously? Rome had faced barbarian invasions before. Julius Caesar had fought Germanic tribes in Gaul in the 1st century BC. Marcus Aurelius had campaigned against them on the Danube in the 2nd century AD. These earlier invasions had been contained. So what changed? Part of the answer is that the barbarians themselves changed. By the 4th century, they were more organized, had adopted better weapons and tactics from contact with Rome, and had formed larger confederations under powerful leaders. But the barbarians were also being pushed. The arrival of the Huns from Central Asia displaced the Goths and other peoples, setting off a chain reaction of migrations. The barbarians were not simply attacking Rome. Many of them were fleeing other barbarians. Moreover, the empire's response to barbarian pressure changed. Instead of destroying invaders or driving them out, Roman emperors increasingly allowed them to settle as foederati, maintaining their own military forces and leadership. This policy of accommodation rather than conquest seemed practical in the short term, but it meant that the empire's borders became porous. Barbarians lived inside the empire but maintained separate identities. When crises came, their loyalty could not be taken for granted. Another major explanation focuses on economic decline. The Roman economy in the late empire was troubled. The currency had been debased during the 3rd century crisis. Inflation had soared. Trade had declined as roads and sea lanes became dangerous. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside. The tax base eroded even as military expenses increased. This economic stress had multiple causes. The empire had expanded until it reached natural barriers like deserts and oceans. With no new territories to conquer, there were no new sources of slaves or plunder to fuel the economy. The mines that produced precious metals for coinage were depleting. Agricultural productivity may have declined due to soil exhaustion, climate change, and loss of labor as populations declined from plague. The government responded to revenue shortfalls by raising taxes, but this created a vicious cycle. Higher taxes drove more people into poverty or caused them to abandon their farms. This reduced the tax base further. Meanwhile, the wealthy found ways to evade taxes, which meant the burden fell heavily on those least able to pay. The economy became less monetized. More transactions happened through barter. Trade networks contracted. Cities, which depended on trade and imperial administration, shrank or were abandoned. Yet the Eastern Empire faced similar economic challenges and survived. Its cities remained prosperous. Its trade networks continued. So clearly, economic decline alone does not explain why the West fell while the East endured. A related explanation emphasizes the burden of imperial administration and military defense. The late Roman Empire was expensive to run. It had a massive bureaucracy. It maintained large armies on multiple frontiers. It provided grain subsidies to the urban poor. It funded public works. All of this required taxation, and the Western Empire's tax base was smaller and poorer than the East's. The military burden was especially heavy. The empire's frontiers were thousands of miles long. Defending them required hundreds of thousands of soldiers. These troops needed to be paid, equipped, fed, and supplied. As threats multiplied in the 4th and 5th centuries, emperors increased the size of the army, which increased costs further. But the Western Empire's revenues were declining, so there was less money available even as expenses grew. The empire tried various expedients. It debased the currency, which caused inflation. It collected taxes in kind rather than in coin, requisitioning grain and goods directly. It made occupations hereditary, forcing farmers and tradesmen to continue in their roles so that tax collection and supply chains would remain stable. But these measures, while providing short-term stability, reduced economic freedom and flexibility, which hindered long-term growth. Some historians have argued that Christianity played a role in Rome's decline. This argument takes several forms. One version suggests that Christian theology, with its emphasis on the next world rather than this one, undermined civic virtue and military spirit. Romans had traditionally been willing to die for the glory of Rome. Christians believed that earthly kingdoms were temporary, and that suffering in this life might lead to reward in the next. This supposedly made them less willing to fight and die for the empire. Another version of this argument suggests that the Christian church diverted resources from the state. Wealthy Romans gave lavish donations to build churches and support monasteries instead of funding the army or public works. Young men became monks instead of soldiers. The church became a powerful institution competing with the state for authority and resources. There may be some truth to these arguments, but they are difficult to prove. The Eastern Empire was just as Christian as the West, yet it survived. Indeed, Christianity may have strengthened the Eastern Empire by providing ideological unity and legitimacy. Christian emperors claimed to rule by God's will, which gave them authority that earlier pagan emperors had lacked. The church also provided social services, caring for the poor and sick, which reduced pressure on the state. Political instability and civil war are another common explanation. The Western Empire in its final centuries suffered from constant internal conflicts. Emperors were murdered by their own generals. Usurpers raised armies and fought for the throne. Provinces broke away under their own claimants. This constant instability prevented coherent long-term policy. Resources that should have been used to defend the frontiers were instead wasted fighting civil wars. The fundamental problem was that the Roman system had no clear mechanism for succession. Emperors were not chosen by democratic vote or clear hereditary rules. They were proclaimed by the army, by the Senate, or by other emperors. This meant that succession was always potentially contested. Strong emperors who commanded respect could maintain order, but weak emperors, boy emperors, or emperors who lost military prestige faced constant challenges. The tetrarchy that Diocletian established tried to solve this problem by creating a formal succession system based on merit, but it failed within a generation because it went against human nature. Fathers wanted their sons to succeed them. Generals wanted to become emperors themselves. The system could not overcome these basic human desires. In the East, succession was more stable, though not without its own crises. Eastern emperors tended to rule longer and to establish dynasties that provided continuity. The West had less luck. From 395 to 476, it saw more than a dozen emperors, most of them ineffective, many of them children, nearly all controlled by military strongmen. Disease and demographic decline have also been suggested as factors. The plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century and other epidemics killed millions. Population decline meant fewer farmers to grow food, fewer artisans to produce goods, fewer soldiers to defend the frontiers, and fewer taxpayers to fund the state. Some historians have estimated that the empire's population may have declined by as much as 20 to 30% from the 2nd century to the 5th century. Lower population density also meant that cities shrank or were abandoned. The extensive urban infrastructure of the early empire could not be maintained with a smaller population. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Public baths closed. Forums emptied. This represented not just economic decline but the collapse of Roman civilization, which had always been urban-based. Another intriguing theory suggests that lead poisoning contributed to Rome's problems. Romans used lead for water pipes, cooking vessels, and even as a sweetener in wine. Chronic lead exposure can cause cognitive impairment, reduced fertility, and shortened lifespans. Could widespread lead poisoning have undermined the health and decision-making capacity of the Roman elite? It is an interesting idea, but difficult to prove, and it would not explain why the Eastern Empire, which used lead just as extensively, survived. Climate change may also have played a role. Some scientific evidence suggests that the late Roman period experienced cooling temperatures and changing rainfall patterns. This could have reduced agricultural productivity, leading to food shortages and economic stress. In turn, food scarcity might have contributed to the migrations of barbarian peoples, as groups moved in search of better lands. The Huns, whose arrival triggered the Gothic migrations, may themselves have been displaced by climate change in Central Asia. Some scholars emphasize the size and diversity of the empire itself as inherent weaknesses. The empire was simply too large to be governed effectively with ancient technology. Communication was slow. It took weeks or months for messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Coordinating policy across such vast distances was nearly impossible. Local officials had enormous autonomy simply because the central government could not supervise them closely. Moreover, the empire encompassed dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures. While Roman culture spread widely, it never completely replaced local identities. In times of strength, these differences were held together by military force, economic prosperity, and the benefits of Roman citizenship. But when the empire weakened, centrifugal forces asserted themselves. Provinces felt little loyalty to distant emperors. Local elites began to cooperate with barbarian settlers, who could provide protection that Rome no longer offered. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, which seemed practical, may have accelerated the West's decline. The two halves had different priorities and increasingly competed for resources. The wealthier East could have helped the struggling West, but often chose not to. Eastern emperors sometimes interfered in Western politics, supporting their own preferred candidates for the Western throne, which contributed to instability. When the Western Empire finally collapsed, the East made no serious effort to save it until Justinian's reconquests decades later, and by then it was too late. Some modern historians have questioned whether we should even speak of Rome falling. They argue that what happened was not collapse but transformation. Roman civilization did not disappear. It evolved, blending with Germanic cultures to create the medieval world. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire preserved much Roman law, culture, and administrative practice. Latin remained the language of learning and religion. Christianity, which had become Rome's official religion, spread to the barbarian peoples and became the unifying cultural force of medieval Europe. In this view, Rome did not fall, it changed. There is truth to this perspective. Cultural continuity existed, but it is also undeniable that much was lost. Urban life declined dramatically. Literacy rates plummeted. Trade networks collapsed. Technological knowledge was forgotten. The Western Mediterranean, which for centuries had been a unified cultural and economic space, fragmented into isolated regions with little contact. The quality of material life for most people probably declined. These were real losses. real collapses, even if they were not absolute. Perhaps the fairest answer is that Rome's fall had no single cause, but resulted from a confluence of challenges that occurred simultaneously and reinforced each other. Military pressure from barbarians, economic decline, political instability, demographic crisis from plague, the division of the empire, cultural and religious transformation, and the sheer size and complexity of trying to govern such a vast territory with ancient technology. Each of these factors weakened the empire in its own way. Together, they created a situation where the Western Empire simply could not sustain itself. The Eastern Empire survived because it had natural advantages. It was wealthier, more urbanized, better defended by geography, and less exposed to the barbarian migrations that devastated the West. But even the East would face its own challenges in the centuries ahead, transforming gradually into what historians call the Byzantine Empire, a Greek-speaking Christian state that would endure until 1453, when Ottoman Turkish forces finally captured Constantinople. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow unraveling that took centuries. And even when it finally ended, in that quiet moment when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, life for most people continued much as it had before. The structures Rome had built, both physical and cultural, did not disappear overnight. They persisted, transformed, and influenced everything that came after. The legacy of Rome, what remained after the fall. When we speak of Rome falling, we need to be careful about what exactly fell. The Western Roman Empire as a political structure ceased to exist in 476. There was no longer an emperor in Italy recognized as the legitimate ruler of the Western provinces. The unified administration, the single currency, the professional army loyal to Rome, all of these disappeared. But Roman civilization did not vanish with the empire. In many ways, it continued, transformed, and wove itself into the fabric of medieval Europe. Consider the barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority. The Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, the Ostrogoths who eventually conquered Italy, the Franks in northern Gaul, the Burgundians along the Rhone Valley. These were not savage tribes destroying civilization. They were peoples who had lived alongside Rome for centuries, who had traded with Romans, fought as Roman soldiers, and absorbed Roman culture. Many barbarian kings saw themselves not as destroyers of Rome, but as its inheritors. They continued to mint coins with images and inscriptions modeled on Roman currency. They maintained Roman administrative structures, employing Roman officials who knew how to collect taxes, keep records, and maintain the bureaucratic machinery of government. They issued laws, but these laws often preserved Roman legal principles, especially for their Roman subjects. In many kingdoms, there was a dual legal system where barbarians lived under tribal law, while Romans continued under Roman law. The Catholic Church, which had grown powerful during the late Empire, became even more important after the political structure collapsed. The Church provided continuity when secular authority fragmented. Bishops, who had been religious leaders, increasingly took on civil functions. When barbarian kings needed literate administrators, they turned to clergy. When cities needed leaders who could negotiate with invaders or organize defense, bishops often filled that role. The Pope in Rome, though he had no armies and controlled little territory, possessed moral authority that extended across the former Western Empire. Latin, the language of Rome, did not disappear. It evolved. In different regions, spoken Latin gradually transformed into what we now call the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. These were not new languages created after Rome fell. They were Latin, changed by time and regional variation, but still recognizably descended from the language of Caesar and Cicero. Written Latin remained the language of the Church, of learning, of law, and of international communication for another 1,000 years. A scholar in Ireland and a scholar in Italy might not be able to understand each other's spoken language, but they could read each other's Latin. Roman law survived and flourished. The legal codes that had been developed over centuries of Roman jurisprudence were preserved, studied, and eventually incorporated into the legal systems of medieval and modern Europe. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian commissioned a massive codification of Roman law known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This compilation preserved legal principles and cases from throughout Roman history. When it was rediscovered in Western Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, it revolutionized legal thinking and formed the basis for the civil law tradition that most European countries still follow today. Roman roads, aqueducts, walls, bridges, and buildings remained. Many were maintained and continued to be used for centuries. The roads that Roman engineers had built to move legions quickly became the highways of medieval trade. Aqueducts continued to supply water to cities until they fell into disrepair, a process that sometimes took centuries. Roman walls protected medieval cities. Roman buildings were repurposed, turned into churches, fortresses, or simply quarried for building materials, but their presence shaped the urban landscape of Europe. Christianity, which had become Rome's official religion in the 4th century, was perhaps Rome's most enduring legacy. The church that emerged in medieval Europe was Roman in structure, Latin in language, and centered in Rome itself. The Pope claimed authority based on the Apostle Peter, who had been martyred in Rome during the 1st century. The administrative structure of the church mirrored the old imperial structure, with dioceses based on Roman provincial boundaries, and a hierarchy of bishops, archbishops, and cardinals that paralleled the old Roman bureaucracy. The church also preserved learning. Monasteries, especially those following the rule of Saint Benedict, became centers of education and manuscript production. Monks copied ancient texts, not just Christian scriptures and theological works, but also classical Latin literature, philosophy, and science. Much of what we know about ancient Rome comes from manuscripts copied in medieval monasteries. Works by Virgil, Cicero, Livy, Tacitus, and many others survived because medieval monks laboriously copied them by hand, generation after generation. The ideal of Rome, the concept of a unified Christian empire stretching across Europe, haunted medieval imagination. In 800, the Frankish king Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome, establishing what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. This was not a restoration of the old Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne's empire was smaller, poorer, and less organized, but the symbolism was powerful. For the next 1,000 years, various German kings would claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor, asserting continuity with ancient Rome even though their empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor particularly unified. The Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries was fundamentally about the rediscovery and celebration of classical Roman and Greek culture. Scholars studied ancient texts with new intensity. Artists studied Roman sculpture and architecture. Writers imitated classical Latin style. The Renaissance humanists saw themselves as reviving civilization after the dark ages of the medieval period. They looked back to Rome as a golden age of learning and culture, a model to emulate. Even our modern political systems owe debts to Rome. The United States Constitution was influenced by Roman republican ideals. The Senate, the concept of checks and balances, the ideal of civic virtue, all of these drew inspiration from Rome. The Founding Fathers read Roman history, quoted Roman authors, and consciously modeled aspects of American government on Roman precedents. The fasces, a Roman symbol of authority, appears in American iconography. The architecture of Washington, with its domed capitol and classical columns, deliberately evokes Rome. Rome's military legacy shaped medieval and modern warfare. Roman military organization, tactics, and engineering influenced how armies were structured and commanded for centuries. The concept of professional soldiers, military discipline, logistical systems to supply armies in the field, all of these were Roman innovations that continued to influence military thinking. In art and architecture, Roman influence was pervasive. The Romanesque style of medieval architecture, with its rounded arches and massive walls, drew directly on Roman building techniques. The Renaissance revival of classical architecture brought back Roman columns, domes, and proportions. Neoclassical architecture in the 18th and 19th centuries again looked to Rome for inspiration. Many of the government buildings, museums, and monuments in major cities around the world are built in styles that descend from Roman architecture. Roman engineering achievements, though not always understood or replicated in the medieval period, set standards that later generations tried to match. The techniques for building roads, bridges, and aqueducts had to be rediscovered or reinvented. When they were, engineers looked to surviving Roman structures as models. Even Roman popular culture left traces. Gladiatorial games ended, but the concept of public spectacles for entertainment continued. Medieval tournaments where knights fought in front of crowds echoed the arena combats. Modern sports, with their stadiums, passionate fans, and professional athletes, owe something to the Roman love of organized competition and mass entertainment. The very concept of empire, of a single political authority ruling over diverse peoples and vast territories, was Roman. Every subsequent European empire, from the Spanish and Portuguese empires that colonized the Americas, to the British Empire that controlled a quarter of the world's land and population, drew on Roman models and Roman rhetoric. The idea that civilization and order could be spread through conquest and administration, for better or worse, was Roman. So when we say Rome fell, we mean that its political structure collapsed, that its territory fragmented, that its military power disappeared, and that the unified Mediterranean world it had created broke apart. All of that is true, but Roman civilization, Roman culture, Roman ideas, these did not fall. They transformed, evolved, and became part of the foundation of European and Western civilization. Rome never really ended. It just changed form. The transition to medieval Europe. A new world emerges. The centuries immediately following the fall of the Western Roman Empire are often called the early Middle Ages, or more pejoratively, the Dark Ages. This term, Dark Ages, came from later medieval and Renaissance scholars who looked back on this period and saw it as a time of cultural decline, loss of learning, and political chaos compared to the glories of classical Rome. Modern historians have largely abandoned this term because it is misleading and unfair. The early Middle Ages were not dark. They were different, a time of transformation and adaptation, when the classical world gave way to something new. The 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries saw dramatic changes in the former Roman world. Urban life declined. Cities that had been thriving centers of commerce and culture shrank dramatically in population. Some were abandoned entirely. The reasons for this urban decline were complex. Trade networks that had connected distant regions broke down as political unity dissolved. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been a Roman highway facilitating easy movement of goods and people, became more dangerous as pirates and rival kingdoms competed for control. Long-distance trade decreased. Cities, which depended on importing food and exporting manufactured goods, suffered. The population of Rome itself, which had been perhaps 1 million at its height, fell to perhaps 30,000 by the 7th century. The aqueducts that had supplied water fell into disrepair. The elaborate bath complexes closed. The forums where citizens had once gathered became ruins. Animals grazed among the monuments. The city survived, but it was a shadow of what it had been. Other cities followed similar trajectories. Some managed to maintain smaller populations and continued as local centers of administration and religion. Others were abandoned, their inhabitants moving to the countryside or to more defensible locations. The urban culture that had defined Roman civilization faded. In the countryside, social structures changed. The villa system, where large estates were owned by wealthy Romans and worked by slaves or tenant farmers, persisted in some regions but transformed in others. As central authority weakened, landowners became more independent, more like local lords than estate managers within an imperial system. They provided protection to the people who worked their lands in exchange for labor and loyalty. This was the beginning of feudalism, though it would take centuries for that system to fully develop. Feudalism was a decentralized social and political system based on personal relationships rather than institutional authority. A lord granted land, called a fief, to a vassal. In exchange, the vassal owed the lord military service and loyalty. The vassal might in turn grant portions of his land to his own vassals, creating a hierarchy of obligations. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land but did not own it. They owed labor and a portion of their crops to their lords, and received protection in return. This system emerged gradually, organically, as people adapted to the collapse of central authority. When there was no longer an imperial government to maintain order, provide justice, and defend against invaders, people created their own local systems of security and governance. It was not a planned transformation. It was a pragmatic response to chaos. Trade declined but did not disappear entirely. Local and regional trade continued. Merchants still moved goods from place to place, but over shorter distances and in smaller quantities. The complex, long-distance trade networks that had moved silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and wine from Gaul across thousands of miles broke down. Markets became more local. Barter became more common as coin money became scarce. Literacy declined. In the Roman world, literacy had been fairly widespread among the urban population and the elite. Schools had taught reading and writing. Books had been copied and circulated. Public inscriptions had been everywhere. With the decline of cities and the disappearance of the imperial bureaucracy, which had employed thousands of literate scribes and administrators, the demand for literacy fell. Schools closed. Fewer people learned to read and write. The church became the primary preserver of literacy. Monasteries maintained schools for training clergy. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. But literacy was now confined to a small, educated elite, almost entirely within the church. The idea of widespread education, of common people learning to read, vanished for centuries. Technology and knowledge were lost. The Romans had developed sophisticated techniques for building roads, bridges, aqueducts, and large stone structures. They had created concrete that could set underwater. They had understood principles of engineering and architecture that allowed them to build massive domes and arches. Much of this knowledge was lost or forgotten. Medieval builders could see Roman structures, could admire and use them, but often could not replicate them. It would take centuries before European builders could again construct on the scale that the Romans had achieved. Medical knowledge declined. Roman doctors had built on Greek medical theories and had developed practical surgical techniques. They understood sanitation, at least to some degree, and the importance of clean water. Medieval medicine became more primitive in many ways, mixing folk remedies, religious beliefs, and fragments of ancient knowledge. Life expectancy, which had never been high even in Roman times, may have fallen further. Agricultural productivity declined in many regions, though this varied. In some areas, agricultural methods remained fairly sophisticated. In others, less productive techniques replaced Roman practices. This, combined with lower population and disrupted trade, meant that food supplies became more uncertain. Famines became more common. Yet it was not all decline. Some things improved or at least stabilized. The constant civil wars that had plagued the late Roman Empire ended. The barbarian kingdoms, once they settled down, provided a measure of local stability. Kings established laws and courts. They protected their territories from other invaders. Life became more predictable, even if it was materially poorer than in Roman times. Christianity continued to spread. Missionary monks traveled beyond the old Roman frontiers, converting peoples who had never been part of the empire. St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century. Irish monks, trained in monasteries that became centers of learning, later traveled to Scotland, England, and continental Europe, establishing new monasteries and spreading literacy and Christian teaching. The conversion of the Franks under their king Clovis around the year 500 was particularly significant. The Franks would become the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and their alliance with the Catholic Church created a partnership that shaped medieval civilization. Frankish kings protected the Pope and the Church. In return, the Church provided ideological legitimacy, crowning kings and teaching that royal authority came from God. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, the Frankish king Charlemagne conquered most of Western Europe, creating an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River, from the North Sea to central Italy. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as emperor. This was a momentous event. It signaled a revival of the imperial ideal, though Charlemagne's empire was very different from Rome's. It was less urbanized, less wealthy, less administratively sophisticated. But it brought together much of Western Europe under a single ruler and the single faith of Catholic Christianity. Charlemagne also sponsored a cultural revival called the Carolingian Renaissance. Scholars from across Europe were invited to his court. Monasteries were encouraged to copy ancient texts. Schools were established to educate clergy and lay administrators. A standardized form of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule was developed, which made texts easier to read and copy. Classical Latin texts were collected, studied, and preserved. It was not a Renaissance in the sense of the later Italian Renaissance, but it was a genuine revival of learning and a conscious attempt to preserve and transmit classical culture. After Charlemagne's death, his empire was divided among his grandsons and eventually fragmented into smaller kingdoms. But the idea of a united Christian Europe, of Christendom, persisted. Europe would never again be politically unified as it had been under Rome, but it shared a common religion, a common learned language in Latin, and common cultural traditions that derived ultimately from the Roman and Christian synthesis. The 9th and 10th centuries brought new waves of invasions. Vikings from Scandinavia raided and then settled in parts of France, England, Ireland, and Russia. Magyars from the steppes invaded Central Europe before settling in what would become Hungary. Muslim raiders from North Africa attacked coastal regions of Italy and France. These invasions caused disruption and suffering, but they also forced further adaptation. Local lords built castles for defense. Knights, armored cavalry warriors, became the dominant military force. The feudal system solidified as people sought protection from those who could provide it. Gradually, order emerged from chaos. By the year 1000, Europe had stabilized. The barbarian invaders had settled and converted to Christianity. Kingdoms had established clear boundaries and relatively stable governments. Agricultural productivity was increasing, population was growing, and new lands were being brought under cultivation. Trade was reviving. Cities were beginning to grow again. This set the stage for the High Middle Ages, the period from roughly 1000 to 1300, when medieval civilization would reach its height. Universities would be founded, Gothic cathedrals would be built, crusades would be launched, population would double, commerce would flourish. It would be a very different world from classical Rome, but one that still acknowledged Rome as its cultural and spiritual ancestor. The transition from the Roman world to the medieval world took centuries and was neither linear nor universal. Different regions experienced different timelines. Italy, with its memories of Rome and its proximity to surviving Roman structures, maintained more continuity with the classical past. Spain, conquered by Muslim invaders in the 8th century, developed a unique hybrid culture blending Christian, Muslim, and Jewish influences. Britain, on the periphery of the Roman world, developed its own distinct culture after the Anglo-Saxon invasions. But across this diversity, certain common themes emerged. Christianity provided religious unity. Latin provided a common learned language. Roman law and Roman administrative concepts provided models for governance. The memory of Rome, idealized and transformed, provided a vision of what civilization could be. Medieval Europe was not Rome restored. It was something new, something that had grown from Roman roots but developed its own character, its own institutions, its own culture. The fall of Rome was not the end of European civilization. It was a transition, a transformation, a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. Rome fell, but what Rome had created, the idea of a unified civilized Europe, the concept of law and order, the Christian religion, the Latin language, the accumulated knowledge and culture of 1,000 years, all of this survived in changed form. Rome's legacy was not a ruin. It was a foundation on which a new civilization would be built. Understanding Rome's fall, modern perspectives. For more than 1,500 years, people have been trying to understand why Rome fell. Every generation has looked at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and drawn its own lessons. The reasons people have given for Rome's decline often say as much about their own times and concerns as they do about ancient Rome. Let us look at how interpretations of Rome's fall have evolved and what modern historians now believe. Edward Gibbon, writing in the late 18th century, produced the most famous work on the subject, his monumental history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon argued that Rome fell because of a loss of civic virtue and military spirit, which he blamed largely on Christianity. According to Gibbon, the Christian emphasis on humility, forgiveness, and other worldly concerns undermined the Roman values of courage, martial pride, and civic duty. Romans had once been willing to die for the glory of Rome. Christians believed that earthly life was temporary and that true rewards came in heaven. This shift in values, Gibbon argued, weakened Rome's ability to defend itself. Modern historians generally reject or heavily modify Gibbon's thesis. Christianity did transform Roman society, but the Eastern Roman Empire was just as Christian as the West and survived for another 1,000 years. Moreover, Christian soldiers fought just as effectively as pagan ones. The real impact of Christianity was more subtle, reshaping cultural priorities and social structures, but not directly causing military collapse. In the early 20th century, Some historians emphasized racial explanations, arguing that Rome fell because of racial mixing, because pure Romans were diluted by barbarians and Eastern peoples. This theory, influenced by the racist ideologies of that era, has been thoroughly discredited. There never was a pure Roman race. Rome had always been a melting pot, incorporating peoples from across its empire. The strength of Rome had been its ability to assimilate diverse populations. The idea that racial purity would have saved Rome is nonsense with no historical support. Some Marxist historians in the 20th century argued that Rome fell because of economic contradictions inherent in slave-based societies. According to this view, the Roman economy depended on constant expansion to provide new slaves. When expansion stopped, the supply of slaves dried up, labor became more expensive, and the whole economic system went into crisis. This analysis contains some truth. The Roman economy did depend heavily on slavery, and the end of major conquests did affect labor supplies. But the relationship was more complex than a simple Marxist model suggests. Slavery declined gradually, not suddenly, and was replaced by other forms of labor organization. The economy did not simply collapse because of labor shortages. Other historians have emphasized environmental and epidemiological factors. Plagues, particularly the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, killed millions and weakened the empire. Climate change may have reduced agricultural productivity and contributed to barbarian migrations. Lead poisoning from water pipes and cookware may have had subtle effects on health and cognition. These factors certainly contributed to Rome's difficulties, but they affected the entire empire, and the East recovered while the West did not. Some scholars have argued that Rome did not really fall at all, or at least that the concept of the fall of Rome is misleading. They point to continuities between the late Roman world and the early medieval world. Barbarian kingdoms preserved Roman administrative structures, Roman law, and Roman culture. Latin evolved into the Romance languages but did not disappear. Christianity, which had become Rome's religion, became medieval Europe's religion. Many aspects of Roman civilization continued. According to this view, we should speak not of the fall of Rome, but of the transformation of the Roman world. This transformation thesis has much to recommend it. It corrects the older narrative that portrayed the barbarian invasions as a catastrophic end to civilization. It acknowledges the continuities and the gradual nature of change, but it can also be taken too far. While cultural continuities existed, the political structure did collapse. The Western Roman Empire as a unified state ceased to exist. Urban life declined dramatically. Trade networks broke down. Literacy rates plummeted. Population fell. The quality of life for most people probably worsened. These were real losses, real declines, not just transformations. Most modern historians take a multi-causal approach. They recognize that Rome's fall resulted from a combination of factors: military, economic, political, demographic, environmental, and cultural, each reinforcing the others. No single cause was sufficient by itself. Together, they created a perfect storm that the Western Empire could not survive. The military challenges were real. Barbarian peoples beyond the frontiers were becoming more organized, more numerous, and more dangerous. The arrival of the Huns set off migrations that put enormous pressure on Roman borders. The Roman army, which had once been a formidable fighting force of citizen soldiers, became increasingly dependent on barbarian recruits who had less loyalty to Rome. Military spending consumed ever larger portions of the imperial budget, crowding out other necessary expenses. The economic problems were real. The 3rd century crisis disrupted trade and devastated the economy. Inflation destroyed the value of currency. Agricultural productivity declined in many regions. The tax base eroded even as expenses increased. The wealthy found ways to avoid taxes, shifting the burden to the poor, which drove more people into poverty or out of the empire entirely. The Western Empire's economy was less robust than the East's, making it less able to withstand shocks. The political instability was real. The Western Empire had no effective mechanism for peaceful succession. Emperors were made and unmade by armies, leading to constant civil wars. Usurpers arose in various provinces, fragmenting the empire's resources and attention. The boy emperors of the 5th century were controlled by generals who often served their own interests rather than the empire's. The Senate had lost real power and could not provide continuity. The demographic crisis was real. Plagues had killed perhaps 20 to 30% of the empire's population. Constant warfare killed more. The population in many regions did not recover. Fewer people meant fewer farmers, fewer artisans, fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers. The empire tried to cope by making occupations hereditary, forcing people to stay in their roles, but this reduced economic flexibility and mobility. The division of the empire into East and West, while pragmatic, proved harmful to the West. The two halves competed for resources rather than cooperating. The wealthier East could have helped the struggling West, but often chose not to. The East diverted barbarian invasions westward. Eastern emperors sometimes supported usurpers in the West, contributing to political instability. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Western Empire faced a problem of scale and complexity that ancient technology and institutions could not solve. The empire was simply too large to be governed effectively with the communication and transportation technologies available. It took weeks for messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Coordinating policy across such distances was nearly impossible. The centralized bureaucratic state that Diocletian and Constantine created was a remarkable achievement, but it required constant supervision and intervention. When that supervision faltered, as it did in the 5th century, the system could not maintain itself. So Rome fell or transformed or evolved, depending on how you look at it. The political structure collapsed. The unified Mediterranean world fragmented. Urban civilization declined, but cultural continuities persisted. The Church preserved aspects of Roman culture. Latin evolved but survived. Roman law influenced medieval legal systems. The memory of Rome shaped European consciousness for over 1,000 years. Understanding Rome's fall matters not just for historical knowledge, but because people have always used Rome as a mirror to reflect on their own societies. When Gibbon wrote about Rome, he was also commenting on the British Empire of his own day. When modern historians discuss Rome's decline, they often have contemporary concerns in mind. Will our own civilization decline like Rome's? What can we learn from Rome's experience? Are there warning signs in our own society that parallel those in late Rome? These are important questions, but they require careful thinking. History does not repeat itself exactly. The challenges facing modern societies are different from those Rome faced. We have technologies, institutions, and knowledge that the Romans lacked. But some patterns are recognizable. The danger of overextension, the burden of military spending, the corrosive effects of inequality, the consequences of political instability, the challenges of managing complex systems. These are recurring themes in history. Rome's fall reminds us that even the mightiest empires are impermanent, that systems which seem eternal can collapse, that societies must constantly adapt to survive. It also reminds us that endings are not always absolute, that civilizations leave legacies that outlive their political structures, that culture and ideas can persist even when empires fall. The story of Rome's decline and fall is ultimately a story about change, about how societies transform under pressure, about what is lost, and what survives when old orders give way to new. It is a story that resonates because it touches on fundamental questions about power, civilization, and human nature. And it is a story that remains endlessly fascinating because it was not simple, not reducible to a single cause or a single narrative, but complex, ambiguous, and open to interpretation. Rome fell slowly over centuries for many reasons, and even in falling, it shaped the world that came after. That is perhaps the most important lesson from the fall of Rome. Empires may collapse, but their influence endures, woven into the fabric of everything that follows. Conclusion: the end and the beginning. We have come to the end of our long journey through the fall of Rome. We have traveled through centuries, from the height of Roman power in the 2nd century, through the chaos of the 3rd, through the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, through the barbarian invasions, to that quiet moment in September 476, when Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor. It is a story without villains or heroes, without simple explanations or easy lessons. Rome did not fall because of one bad emperor or one military defeat or one barbarian tribe. It fell because it faced multiple crises simultaneously: military, economic, political, demographic, and cultural, each reinforcing the others, creating a downward spiral from which it could not escape. The Western Roman Empire, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries, fragmented into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, wealthier and better defended, survived and evolved into the Byzantine Empire. But the unified Roman world was gone. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake, became a frontier between competing civilizations. Yet Rome did not vanish. Its language evolved into the Romance languages that millions speak today. Its law influenced legal systems around the world. Its engineering marvels, roads and aqueducts and walls, shaped the landscape of Europe for centuries. Its literature continued to be read and studied. Its memory haunted European consciousness, inspiring rulers who sought to recreate its glory, scholars who sought to recover its learning, and artists who sought to capture its beauty. The church that Rome had adopted became medieval Europe's unifying institution, preserving literacy, providing social services, and creating a common culture across politically fragmented lands. Monasteries copied manuscripts, maintaining the thin thread of learning that connected the ancient and medieval worlds. Popes claimed spiritual authority over all Christians, creating a parallel empire of faith where the political empire had once stood. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule were not enemies of civilization, but its inheritors, preserving and adapting Roman traditions while adding their own cultures and customs. Over centuries, these kingdoms evolved into the nations of modern Europe. France, Spain, Italy, England, all have roots in the post-Roman world, shaped by the interaction of Roman and barbarian cultures. The fall of Rome marked the end of ancient history and the beginning of the medieval period. It was a hinge point, a moment of transition when one world ended and another began. The transformation was gradual, often painful, sometimes catastrophic. Urban populations declined, trade contracted, learning became more rare. Life became harder and more uncertain for many people. But transformation also brought opportunity. New kingdoms emerged with their own identities and traditions. Christianity spread beyond the old Roman borders, creating a cultural unity that transcended political boundaries. Agricultural innovations eventually led to population growth. New institutions like feudalism and the manorial system, however exploitative, provided stability and order when centralized authority had vanished. By the year 1000, Europe had stabilized. The invasions had ended. Populations were growing. Agriculture was improving. Cities were beginning to revive. Trade was increasing. The foundations had been laid for the remarkable flourishing of the High Middle Ages, when Gothic cathedrals would rise, universities would be founded, and European civilization would reach new heights of achievement. This later medieval civilization was not Rome restored. It was something new, born from Roman roots but distinct, with its own character, its own institutions, and its own culture. It was a world of castles and cathedrals, knights and monks, feudal lords and peasant farmers. It was a world of vernacular languages and national identities beginning to form. It was a Christian world, united by faith even as it remained politically divided. The memory of Rome remained powerful throughout the medieval period and beyond. Charlemagne sought to revive the Roman Empire in the West. Later German kings claimed the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The Renaissance looked back to classical Rome as a golden age of learning and culture to be studied and imitated. Enlightenment thinkers found in Rome examples of republican virtue and civic duty. Modern nations incorporated Roman symbols into their iconography and Roman principles into their governments. Today, more than 1,500 years after the fall, Rome's influence remains visible all around us. We use a calendar reformed by Julius Caesar and a modified version of the Roman alphabet. Our legal systems descend from Roman law. Our architecture incorporates Roman styles. Our languages, especially in Europe but also English with its heavy Latin borrowings, carry Roman words and grammar structures. Our concepts of citizenship, republic, empire, senate, all come from Rome. When we speak of the fall of Rome, we speak of an event that still shapes our world. The fall of the Roman Empire was not a single catastrophe that happened in one day or one year. It was a process that unfolded over centuries, a gradual transformation from the ancient to the medieval world. It reminds us that even the greatest empires are not eternal, that power and glory are temporary, but also that civilizations leave legacies that outlive their political structures. Rome fell, but Rome also endured in the languages, laws, religions, and memories of everyone who came after. And so we conclude our journey. The Roman Empire, which had seemed as permanent as the stars, which had brought order and civilization to the Mediterranean world, which had survived for 5 centuries and shaped the lives of millions, came to an end. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a long, slow decline. Not completely, for much of what Rome created survived in transformed ways. The fall of Rome teaches us about the fragility of civilizations, the inevitability of change, and the enduring power of culture and ideas. It reminds us that nothing lasts forever, but also that nothing truly ends. Rome fell, but Rome never died. It lives on in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the buildings we admire, the books we read, and the ideas we inherit. Thank you for joining me on this long exploration of one of history's most fascinating and important stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fall of Rome, please like this video and subscribe to Midnight Library for more historical narratives told at this slow, contemplative pace. Let me know in the comments what you learned or what surprised you, and what historical topic you would like to explore next. Until next time, sleep